The Bridge Between Us. Table of Contents, Part I, The Weight of Unspoken Words, I, Chapter 1, The Weight of Unspoken Words, Chapter 2, A Glimmer of Potential, Chapter 3, The First Obstacle, Part 2, Shifting Sands, 2, Chapter 4, The Arrival of Intorn, Chapter 5, Whispers and Wonders, Chapter 6, The Unspoken Truth, Part 3. Cracks in the Foundation, 3, Chapter 7, A Spark of Jealousy, Chapter 8, The Business Pitch, Chapter 9, The Intervention of Fate, Part 4, Points of No Return, 4, Chapter 10, The English Test, Chapter 11, The Lure of the Unknown, Chapter 12, A Night Out, Part V, Falling Apart, V, Chapter 13. The Jealousy Escalates, Chapter 14, Consequences of Secrecy, Chapter 15, The Truth About Donatello, Part 6, Rebuilding, 6, Chapter 16, Evra's Realization, Chapter 17, The Breaking Point, Chapter 18, The Aftermath of Truth, Chapter 19, Rebuilding Bridges, Chapter 20, The Eternity of Connection. 145, 2. The Bridge Between Us. Chapter 1, The Weight of Unspoken Words. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of their bedroom, casting soft shadows across the hardwood floor. Lion stirred first, as he always did, his internal clock more reliable than any alarm. He lay still for a moment, listening to Evra's steady breathing beside him, watching the gentle rise and fall of her bare shoulder above the tangled sheets. There was something achingly beautiful about her in sleep, the way her dark hair spilled across the pillow, the peaceful expression that replaced the subtle tension he'd been noticing in her eyes lately. But even in this quiet moment, he felt that strange weight pressing down on his chest, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the physical world and everything to do with the words that lived trapped inside him like caged birds. Words about dreams deferred, about the growing restlessness that kept him staring at the ceiling long after she'd fallen asleep. Words about the fear that maybe, just maybe, he was becoming the kind of man who let life happen to him instead of seizing it. Lion slipped from bed carefully, his feet finding the cool floor without a sound. The apartment was small but comfortable, a third-floor walk-up in an old building with charm that made up for its quirks. He padded to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar ritual of making coffee. The grinding of beans seemed unnecessarily loud in the morning stillness, and he found himself glancing toward the bedroom, hoping he hadn't disturbed her. But Evra was already stirring. He could hear the soft rustle of sheets, the small sigh she made when consciousness pulled her from whatever dreams had occupied her night. Dreams, he wondered, that might be more vivid and fulfilling than their shared waking reality. "Morning," she said softly, appearing in the doorway wearing his oversized grey t-shirt, her legs bare, hair tousled in a way that still made his breath catch after 3 years together. But there was something in her eyes, a guardedness that hadn't been there in the beginning, a careful measuring that suggested she was watching him, waiting for something he couldn't quite name. "Morning, beautiful," he replied, though the endearment felt heavy on his tongue. Not false, exactly, but weighted with things unsaid. He poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, hers the cheerful yellow ceramic she'd bought at a street fair, his a plain white one from the office that he'd somehow claimed as his own. She accepted the mug with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're up early again. Couldn't sleep?" The admission came out more honestly than he'd intended, and he saw the way her gaze sharpened slightly, as if she were trying to read between the lines of his simple statement. "Bad dreams?" she asked, settling onto one of the 2 stools at their small breakfast bar. The morning light caught the golden flecks in her brown eyes, and for a moment he was transported back to their early days, when conversations flowed like water between them, when every shared glance felt like a secret language only they understood. Not dreams exactly. He leaned against the counter, coffee warm between his palms. "Just thinking." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. "Thinking about what?" Her expression seemed to ask, though she didn't voice the question. This was the dance they'd been performing for months now, the careful steps around topics that felt too dangerous to approach directly. His restlessness. Her growing need for something he couldn't quite identify or provide. The way their conversations had slowly shifted from dreams shared to dreams harbored in solitude. About work, she prompted gently, though they both knew his job at the marketing firm was stable, predictable, and utterly unfulfilling. It paid the bills and provided insurance, but it did nothing to feed the part of him that yearned for something more, something that felt like purpose rather than mere survival. Among other things. He took a sip of coffee, using the moment to study her face. There were small changes he'd noticed lately, a tightness around her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she sometimes started to say something before catching herself and choosing safer words instead. "What about you? You seemed restless last night." It was true. She'd shifted and turned beside him, her body a coiled spring of energy that seemed to have no outlet. When he'd reached for her in the darkness, she'd responded physically but with a distance that was somehow more profound than any rejection might have been. They'd moved together in familiar patterns, but it had felt like a conversation conducted in a language they were both forgetting. "I've been thinking too," she said quietly, and something in her tone made him look up sharply. There was a weight to those words, a significance that made his chest tighten with anticipation and dread in equal measure. "About?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it might contain the answers to questions she hadn't yet learned how to ask. When she looked up, her eyes held a vulnerability that made him want to cross the small distance between them and pull her into his arms. But something held him back, the same invisible barrier that seemed to rise between them whenever they approached anything real, anything that mattered. "About us," she said finally. "About what we want. What we're doing." The words should have opened a door, should have been the invitation to finally speak the truths that had been accumulating like sediment in the quiet spaces of their relationship. Instead, Lion felt that familiar tightening, that reflexive pulling back that happened whenever conversations threatened to venture into territory that felt too vast, too important to navigate without a map. "We're doing fine," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were inadequate. Fine was such a pale, insufficient word for what they were or what they had been, or what they might be if they could only find a way to bridge the growing space between them. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing his response, deciding whether to push forward or retreat into the safety of surface conversation. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, full of possibility and peril. "Are we?" she asked softly, and there was something almost plaintive in her voice that made his heart clench. "Sometimes I feel like we're just existing in parallel. Like we're playing house instead of actually building something real." Her words hit him with unexpected force, crystallizing feelings he'd been trying to ignore. She was right, of course. They had fallen into patterns that looked like intimacy from the outside but felt increasingly hollow from within. They shared a bed, a lease, grocery lists, and streaming service passwords, but when was the last time they'd shared a dream? When had they last talked about the future as something they were actively creating together rather than something that was simply happening to them? "I don't know what you want me to say," he replied, and immediately regretted the defensive edge in his voice. This was exactly what he did whenever emotional territory became too complex to navigate. He found ways to shut down the conversation, to retreat behind walls that kept him safe but also kept them apart. "I want you to say what you're thinking," she said, leaning forward slightly, her eyes searching his face. "I want you to tell me about these thoughts that keep you awake at night. I want to know what you dream about when you're not dreaming about us." There it was, the invitation he'd been both longing for and dreading. She was asking him to let her in, to trust her with the restlessness and ambition and fear that lived in the private chambers of his heart. She was asking him to be vulnerable in a way that felt terrifying and essential in equal measure. But instead of opening, he felt himself closing. It was an automatic response, as natural as breathing, and just as unconscious. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" The question was gentle but persistent. "We used to talk about everything. Remember when we first met? We'd stay up all night just talking about books and dreams and crazy ideas. When did we stop doing that? He remembered. God, how could he forget those early nights when the world felt infinite and malleable, when their conversations felt like joint expeditions into territory neither had explored alone. They'd talked about traveling, about the businesses they might start, about the art she wanted to make and the stories he wanted to tell. They'd shared secret fears and impossible hopes with the easy generosity of people who believed the future was something they could shape with their bare hands. We grew up, he said, though the words felt like a betrayal even as he spoke them. We got responsible. Or we got scared, she countered quietly, and her words landed with the force of absolute truth. Maybe we got so scared of failing at our dreams that we stopped dreaming altogether. The accusation hung between them, gentle but devastating. Because she was right, wasn't she? Somewhere along the way, they had both made the quiet compromises that felt like wisdom at the time but now seemed like small deaths. He'd stopped writing the novel that lived in fragments on his laptop. She'd stopped painting, her easel gathering dust in the corner of what they optimistically called the office but was really just a repository for things they were too attached to throw away but too afraid to actively use. Lion set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary, the small sound sharp in the morning quiet. I should get ready for work. It was a retreat, pure and simple, and they both knew it. But Evra didn't call him on it directly. Instead, she nodded with the sort of careful neutrality that somehow felt worse than anger would have. Of course, she said. I should too. But neither of them moved. They sat in the growing tension, each waiting for the other to say something that might bridge the gap that had opened between them, a gap that felt both sudden and ancient, as if it had been there all along, hidden beneath the comfortable routines of their shared life. Evra, he began, then stopped. What could he say? That he'd been thinking about quitting his job to start the consulting business that lived only in his imagination? That he woke up most mornings feeling like he was sleepwalking through a life that belonged to someone else? That he loved her but sometimes felt like he was failing her in ways he couldn't even articulate? What? She asked, and there was hope in her voice that made his throat tight. Nothing, he said finally. Just, have a good day. The disappointment that flickered across her face was quickly suppressed, replaced by the sort of bright, practiced smile that felt like a door closing. You too. He retreated to the bathroom, where he went through the motions of his morning routine with mechanical precision. Shower, shave, brush teeth, all performed with the careful attention to detail that characterized his entire existence lately. Everything precise, everything controlled, everything safe. But as he stood under the hot spray, water running down his face like unshed tears, he couldn't escape the weight of what had just happened. Or rather, what hadn't happened. Another missed opportunity, another moment when they could have chosen courage over comfort and instead had chosen the familiar path of avoidance. In the bedroom, he could hear Evra moving around, the soft sounds of her own preparations for the day. The intimacy of these shared morning routines had once felt precious evidence of how thoroughly their lives had become intertwined. Now it felt almost clinical, a performance of domesticity that lacked the warmth that had once made it meaningful. He dressed for work in the same clothes he always wore, slacks, button-down shirt, tie that marked him as professional but not particularly ambitious. The uniform of a man who had made peace with mediocrity, even if that peace felt increasingly fragile. When he emerged from the bedroom, Evra was already dressed for her job at the nonprofit where she managed grants for arts education programs. It was work that mattered, work that fed some essential part of her, but he knew it wasn't enough. She'd mentioned, in passing, that she'd been thinking about taking on freelance projects, maybe exploring her own creative practice again. But those comments had been offered tentatively, as if she weren't sure he'd be supportive, and his responses had been encouraging but abstract, lacking the enthusiasm that might have helped her transform possibility into action. I might be late tonight, she said, checking her reflection in the small mirror by the door. There's a meeting about the summer programming. Okay, he replied, though something in her tone suggested there was more to the story. But he didn't ask for details, just as she hadn't pushed for details about his sleepless nights and mysterious thoughts. They kissed goodbye, a brief press of lips that felt more like punctuation than affection. Once, their goodbye kisses had lingered, full of reluctance to separate and anticipation for reunion. Now they felt perfunctory, items to be checked off the list of things that couples do. After she left, Lion stood in the quiet apartment, surrounded by the debris of their interrupted conversation. Her coffee mug still sat on the counter, lipstick traces on the rim. The morning light had grown stronger, revealing dust motes dancing in the air and highlighting the small imperfections they'd learned to live with: the scuff mark on the wall where they'd moved the couch, the slight water stain on the ceiling from last winter's leak. He thought about her words, "We're playing house instead of actually building something real." The truth of it sat in his chest like a stone. When had they stopped being architects of their shared life and become mere inhabitants of it? His phone buzzed with a text from his boss, reminding him about the morning meeting he'd forgotten. The familiar anxiety of professional obligation kicked in, overriding the more complex emotional landscape of the morning's conversation. This was easier: the clear expectations and concrete deliverables of work, the simple transaction of time for money that required no deep introspection or emotional courage. But as he gathered his things and prepared to leave the apartment, Lion couldn't shake the image of Evra's face when she'd asked him to share his thoughts. There had been something almost desperate in her expression, a reaching that he'd reflexively pulled away from. And in that pulling away, he recognized a pattern that extended far beyond their morning conversation: a consistent choice of safety over intimacy, of protection over connection. The weight of unspoken words followed him out the door and into the city morning, heavy as gravity, persistent as shadow. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered how long they could continue this careful dance of avoidance before the music stopped entirely, leaving them standing on opposite sides of a silence too vast to bridge. The morning had begun with possibility, with Evra's gentle invitation to genuine communication, and ended with the familiar retreat into separate worlds. But something felt different this time, more final somehow. As if they had used up their allotment of missed opportunities and were approaching some kind of reckoning that neither was prepared for but both could sense approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Lion walked toward the subway, his footsteps echoing off the morning sidewalks, carrying him toward another day of careful competence and quiet desperation. Behind him, the apartment held the ghost of their conversation, the echo of questions asked and not answered, the weight of a love that felt increasingly like something they were afraid to touch for fear it might crumble in their hands. Chapter 2: A glimmer of potential. The air in the office felt stale that morning, a dense mixture of recycled climate control and the faint metallic tang of electronics humming endlessly in the background. Lion sat at his desk, the cursor blinking on the spreadsheet like an impatient heartbeat. Numbers lined up neatly in ordered cells, precise, sterile, detached from anything resembling life. His tie felt too tight, though he'd knotted it exactly as he had every morning for years. Outside the window, the city stretched into a pale autumn haze, muted and unreachable. He was supposed to be preparing the quarterly client report, adjusting charts to make the story they wanted to sell appear inevitable. But the words from Evra's lips that morning kept replaying like a whisper trapped in the walls. Sometimes I feel like we're just existing in parallel. The phrase had lodged itself under his skin. Now, even as he tried to focus on profit margins and demographic trends, it pulsed there, an unrelenting ache. "Lion," came a voice from the doorway. He looked up to see Donatello leaning casually against the frame, grinning the way men do when they carry secrets they expect to share. Donatello, with his burnt espresso skin, neatly pressed blazer, and eyes that could turn a negotiation into either a surrender or a celebration depending on his mood. He'd joined the company 2 years ago, but he'd never worn the weary corporate mask the rest of them had adopted. He belonged to the world outside these cubicle walls, you could feel it. "You busy?" Donatello asked, already stepping inside without waiting for an answer. His cologne, a faint, earthy spice, was a reminder of late-night wine bars where conversations curled into the small hours. Not really, Lion said, minimizing the spreadsheet as though to hide the hollowness of his morning. Good. Walk with me. It wasn't really a request. They ended up in the small cafe tucked at the edge of the plaza, the kind of place favored by freelance types with laptops and people who talked into earbuds as though performing for unseen cameras. The espresso machine hissed like a conspirator. Donatello ordered for both of them double-shot macchiatos, Lions with 1 sugar, though he hadn't mentioned that detail in years. There's an opening, Donatello began, stirring idly. A few of us are leaving the firm. We've been approached by a startup based in Florence, boutique consultancy, high-end market strategy for creatives. They want someone with your kind of precision, but also some vision. That novel you used to talk about, Don't Think I Forgot. Lion blinked. Florence. The word curled in his mouth like an echo of something he'd once dreamed. Yet. Mostly remote work, occasional travel. More independence, bigger stakes. Not for everyone, too uncertain for the comfort crowd. But I thought, Donatello shrugged. I thought maybe you were ready for uncertain. Lion stared into the dark surface of his drink. Ready? He couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked him if he was ready for anything. He lived in a world of deadlines and careful budgets, a world where risk was disguised as irresponsibility. But even as doubt rose in him, there was the subtle thrill, the hint of some long-caged animal shifting. You don't need to answer now, Donatello added, his tone light but his gaze penetrating. Just, don't pretend the idea doesn't make you breathe differently. Lion smiled faintly, though the smile felt foreign on his face. I'll think about it. Number Evra. After hours, the day at the non-profit had bled into evening with the colors of late sunlight streaming across the wide windows of the old arts building. Most staff had already left, the hallways quiet except for the muted hum of the ventilation and the sound of soft conversation spilling from the conference room where Evra sat. The table was littered with sketches, fabric swatches, and program outlines. Summer planning was months away, but for artists, months were minutes, and visions needed early breath. Evra, what if you oversaw the mural project? Asked Maribel, the program coordinator, her large hands still stained faintly with cerulean paint. You've got the eye for composition, and honestly, I've seen your old portfolio. You hide that talent too much. Evra laughed softly, deflecting. I'm not sure anyone wants to see my work after all this time. I do, Maribel countered, her eyes fierce. And I think you do, too. Don't you miss it? Evra's hand lingered on a charcoal sketch someone had left on the table. Lines, imperfect and alive, seemed to pulse under her fingertips. She thought of the canvases that had once crowded the cramped apartment she'd rented before Lion. Of the way she'd come home with white streaks in her hair from throwing herself into painting like someone trying to get free of gravity. I miss, Evra began, then stopped. The truth was too large for casual conversation. Walking home later, the city's night pressed close, all neon edges and the scent of rain on pavement. She passed a small gallery she hadn't noticed in months, its windows spilling golden light onto the sidewalk. Inside, a woman stood before a massive canvas, brush in hand, moving with a grace Evra instantly recognized, the trance of being lost in creation. Without thinking, she pressed her palm to the cold glass, a ghost of longing knotting in her chest. Number Lion's ride home on the train, pressed between strangers smelling faintly of damp wool and exhaustion, Lion stared at the outline of Donatello's words in his mind. Florence. Consulting for creatives. A life that carried the tantalizing balance of structure and invention. It was absurd. Reckless. Dangerous. He could almost hear his father's tight voice cautioning about security and stability. But Evra's voice from that morning was louder now, like we're just existing in parallel. He wondered whether part of that parallelism was his own refusal to admit he wanted to live differently. Rolling shadows flickered across his face as the train plunged in and out of tunnels, each burst of light seeming to catch a different version of himself. Number Evra's decision. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she stopped at the art supply store near the university. The smell of oil paints, raw canvas, and sharp graphite hit her like a remembered embrace. Without planning, she bought a small set of brushes, a few tubes of paint, and a block of heavy paper. It was modest. Safe. But her fingers curled around the bag as though holding a secret flame. The dinner. They arrived home within minutes of each other, the coincidence making them exchange polite, surprised smiles. Lion offered to make pasta. Evra agreed before realizing she'd barely tasted food the night before. Soon the small apartment smelled of garlic and simmering tomatoes, the soundtrack the gentle clink of utensils and the occasional exhale. "How was your day?" Evra asked, arranging the napkins without looking up. "Busy," Lion said. "Meetings, reports," a pause, then the untruth by omission. "The usual." She nodded, twirling pasta onto her fork. "I stayed late. Planning for the summer programs." "That's good. You love that part of the job." His smile was genuine, if a little distracted, almost affectionate in its distance. They spoke about safe topics, a neighbor's new dog, a strange billboard she'd seen on her way in, the broken elevator at his office. Their words skimmed the surface like insects over water, never breaking the tension below. At one point, their eyes met and held for a fraction too long. In that moment, Evra wondered if his mouth would finally shape words about something real, something unscripted. Lion considered telling her about Florence, about Donatello, about the way the offer had felt like a door swinging open after years of walls. But the machinery of habit intervened. He took another bite. She looked down. The silence that followed was gentle but dangerous, like the quiet before a wave breaks. After dinner, they parted ways within the apartment, he to his laptop under the pretext of responding to emails, she to the small corner where her new brushes waited in their paper bag. She didn't bring them out. Not yet. It was enough, for tonight, to know they were there. Lion sat in the half-light, the cursor blinking on a blank document, not the quarterly report, not even a list of pros and cons about Florence. Just a space, waiting. In the other room, Evra leaned against the wall, imagining the first stroke of paint on a clean surface. Yet neither spoke through the thin stretch of hallway between them. They slept that night with their backs curved toward each other, not in rejection but in the fragile hope that the other might be dreaming something worth waking for. Between them, the air vibrated with two separate secrets, small, glowing promises neither dared to share. "Got it." I'll keep the tone, pacing, and metaphorical richness consistent with the previous chapter, while deepening the emotional distance between Lion and Evra through the lens of early obstacles and missed connections. Here's your fully written Chapter 3, the first obstacle in English, around 3,000 words, so it seamlessly follows Chapter 2. Chapter 3, the first obstacle. The rain had started some time before dawn, not in bursts but in a light, patient drizzle that seemed determined to soak the city in silence. Lion woke to the sound of it tapping against the bedroom window, the sky a washed-out silver beyond the glass. Evra was still asleep, her breathing slow, her arm curved loosely around the pillow as though holding onto a dream. He stood by the window for a moment, watching the threads of water gather, slide, and vanish. It reminded him of roads he might never take if he hesitated too long. Lion cracks in the plan at the office. The news came swiftly. Donatello's voice over the phone had none of its usual swagger. "The Florence deal's changed," he said. "The investors pulled back. Market instability, they're calling it. They still want us on board, but the initial funding terms aren't what we discussed." "How bad?" Lion asked. "Bad enough that we'd be working on shoestring budgets for the first year. Travel would be on our own dime until we bring in profits." "And the equity stake?" "Slashed in half." Lion's jaw tightened. "So in other words, no safety net." "Exactly. Which is why some of the others are already out." For the rest of the day, his meetings blurred into muted conversations, his focus shredded by the echo of Donatello's words. The shimmer of Florence, the golden possibility he had nurtured in the corners of his mind, dimmed like a candle hit by wind. Now, all he could see were the jagged edges, the risk of draining savings, the specter of failure looming too close. He imagined Evra's face if he admitted he was considering it anyway. Would she think it reckless? Would she see it as a threat to even the fragile stability they had left? By mid-afternoon, his spreadsheet columns swam in his vision. He caught himself staring at his reflection in the black of his monitor, a man framed by numbers and fluorescent emptiness, wondering if he was too old or too afraid to leap. Number Evra. A spark shared too softly the following evening. Evra came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed from the wind and from something rarer, a quiet excitement. In her bag, neatly wrapped in brown paper, was her first small canvas in years, its surface already brushed with broad, tentative strokes. The mural planning meeting had rolled into something more. She'd been invited to submit a personal piece for the gallery's winter fundraiser. It wasn't much. It wasn't Florence. But it was something. She found Lion hunched over his laptop at the dining table, his tie loosened, hand absently cupping his jaw. The glow of the screen washed his face pale. She set her bag down and stood in the doorway for a moment, as if gauging the weather. "I started painting today," she said, the words carrying a warmth she hadn't heard in her own voice for a long time. "MHM." His eyes stayed fixed on the laptop, fingers tracing aimless patterns on the keyboard. "That's good. You've always been good at that stuff." "That stuff?" She smiled faintly. "It's not just stuff. I'm working on a piece for the fundraiser. It could actually end up," he cut in without meaning to. "Sorry, can we talk after I finish this thought? It's about something time-sensitive." The warmth dulled. She nodded, retreating into the kitchen, telling herself he was tired, that timing wasn't on her side. Number missed moments later, when he finally closed the laptop, he wandered into the bedroom where she was sitting on the edge of the bed, sketchbook open on her lap. He kissed the top of her head, almost absent-mindedly, then shed his shirt and sat beside her. "What were you saying earlier? About a fundraiser?" She glanced down at her sketch. "It's nothing. Just a small thing." "You should do it," he said, his tone honest but distracted. "You're talented." Then he leaned back, scrolling through something on his phone. The conversation ended there, smothered under the weight of everything unsaid. Number night intimacy's edges. They tried, later, to bridge the distance with the oldest language they knew, touch. But even here, the hesitations crept in. His hands wandered but his thoughts drifted. She could feel the absence behind his closeness. Her body tensed in subtle reflexes, his movements slowed as though waiting for a signal that never came. The room felt cooler than it should have, the breath between them heavy with what they weren't saying. When it was over, they lay tangled but restless, their skin cooling faster than their doubts. Lion turned onto his side, eyes tracing the faint water stain on the ceiling like it was a map to somewhere else. Evra stared into the dark, her fingers drumming quietly against her own arm, counting out a rhythm no one else heard. Number Lion. The weight of choice. The following morning, Donatello called again. "If you're in, you need to commit now. The others who are staying? They're ready to ride this out. But you've got to want it enough to bleed for it." Lion stood by the kitchen counter, coffee cooling in his hand. He could hear the shower running in the bathroom, the faint sound of Evra singing under her breath a song he didn't recognize. "I'll think about it," he said, though they both knew that thinking was just the slowest way of saying maybe not. Number Evra. The silence after the song. When she emerged, towel around her shoulders, she told him she'd be late again that night. "Maribel's helping me with the piece. I want to get the colors right." "That's fine," he said, folding his jacket over his arm. "I've got stuff to do anyway." There was no kiss goodbye, no deliberate withholding, just the kind of casual omission that grows roots unnoticed. That evening, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain again. Lion sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the business proposal in front of him. Evra, a few blocks away, stood under the harsh white lights of the studio, brush in hand, coaxing shapes from shadows. In their separate spaces, both of them were wrestling with the same quiet truth, that the first obstacle in chasing something real isn't always the world outside, it's the distance between your own fear and someone else's understanding. By midnight, they were asleep in the same bed, backs turned, connected only by the thinnest thread of shared breathing. Dreams, if they came, belonged to each of them alone. Okay, I'll build on the existing tension by introducing Intorn as a catalyst, and maintain the atmospheric style so it feels consistent. This will be Chapter 4, The Arrival of Intorn in English, approximately 3,000 words. Chapter 4, The Arrival of Intorn. The doorbell rang late on Saturday afternoon, a sharp, insistent buzz that sliced through the quiet inertia that had settled over the apartment. Lion was attempting to read, but the words on the page swam meaninglessly. Evra was hunched over her small canvas in the corner, her shoulders tense, her gaze fixed. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with the scent of damp earth. "Expecting someone?" Lion asked, though his tone was already resigned. Spontaneity had become a rare guest in their lives. Evra shook her head, her fingers still gripping the brush. "Must be a mistake." He sighed, marking his page with a receipt, and went to answer the door. Number Intorn. The unexpected mirror standing in the hallway, grinning like a sunbeam after weeks of rain, was Intorn. He was a friend from their shared past, a time when both Lion and Evra had been different people, more open, more reckless, more alive. Intorn had a way of making small spaces feel vast, of turning mundane moments into something charged with possibility. "Surprise," he boomed, pulling Lion into a brief, awkward hug. "Thought I'd drop in. Been too long, hasn't it?" Lion managed a smile, though his mind was already calculating the disruption Intorn's arrival would bring. "Intorn. What are you doing here?" "Needed a change of scenery. And I missed you both. Heard whispers you two were becoming hermits. Had to stage an intervention." He stepped inside, filling the small apartment with his presence. He was dressed casually but impeccably, worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and boots that looked like they'd seen more miles than Lion's car. He moved with an easy confidence that made Lion suddenly conscious of his own carefully chosen clothes and the book he hadn't been reading. Evra emerged from her corner, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her expression was a mixture of surprise and something else Lion couldn't quite decipher, perhaps a flicker of the old excitement Intorn used to evoke. "Intorn. This is," she hesitated. "This is a surprise. A welcome one, I hope." He crossed the room and embraced her, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary. "You look different. In a good way. More focused." Number Sensing the quiet wounds within minutes, Intorn had rearranged the furniture, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and launched into a whirlwind of anecdotes and observations. He was a master of casual intimacy, of drawing people out with a combination of charm and perceptive prodding. He glanced around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the small canvas in the corner. "So, Evra's back at it, I see. Always said you had fire in your hands. What's this one about?" Evra shrugged, glancing at Lion before speaking. "Just a small thing. Something for a fundraiser." "Small things can be louder than thunder," Intorn countered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Don't undersell yourself. Talent is a sin to waste." He turned to Lion. "And you? Still crunching numbers? Always knew you were meant for more than spreadsheets." Lion felt a flush rise to his face. "Works, fine. Fine is the enemy of extraordinary," Intorn said, his voice laced with amusement. "Remember that novel you were going to write? The one that would change the world?" What happened to that fire? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Evra's gaze flickered between them, her expression unreadable. Number unsolicited truths. Over the next few hours, Intorn moved through the apartment like a force of nature, disrupting the careful choreography of their lives. He insisted they order takeout, telling stories of his travels, asking pointed questions about their work, their dreams, their happiness. So, what's the secret? He asked at one point, leaning back in his chair, his eyes twinkling. 3 years together. What's keeping the spark alive? Lion and Evra exchanged a quick, awkward glance. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. We're happy, Lion said finally, though the word sounded hollow even to his own ears. Intorn raised an eyebrow. Happy is a state of being, not a description. What are you two actually building? What are you fighting for? Evra set down her chopsticks, her fingers tracing the rim of her plate. We're not fighting, she said softly. We're just living. Living isn't enough, Intorn countered. Living is what happens when you're waiting to die. You need a mission. You need a passion. You need something to set your blood on fire. He looked from one to the other, his expression serious. Don't let comfort become a cage. Don't let the quiet kill you. Number echoes of inner struggles later, after the takeout containers had been cleared and the coffee had grown cold, Intorn pulled Lion aside. I'm just saying. I see it in your eyes, man. That restlessness. The feeling that you're meant for more. Don't let it fade. Don't let it turn into regret. He clapped Lion on the shoulder. And Evra, she's got that look too. The look of someone who's on the verge of something big. Don't hold her back. He winked, then turned to Evra. You two need to talk. Really talk. Not just about the weather and the broken elevator. Talk about what matters. Before it's too late. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lion felt a wave of resentment wash over him. Who was Intorn to come into their lives and stir up all this dormant discontent? Number departure and aftermath. Intorn stayed for only one night, leaving early the next morning with a casual promise to return soon. As they stood on the doorstep, watching him disappear down the street, Lion and Evra were silent. The apartment felt strangely empty, as though a vital organ had been removed. He means well, Evra said finally, breaking the silence. Maybe, Lion replied, his tone flat. Or maybe he just likes stirring things up. They went back inside, each retreating to their separate corners of the apartment. Lion picked up his book, but the words still refused to form coherent sentences. Evra stared at her canvas, but the colors seemed dull and lifeless. Intorn's visit had been a brief, jarring intrusion, a reminder of all the things they weren't saying, all the dreams they were letting wither. He had held up a mirror to their lives, and neither of them liked what they saw. That night, they lay in bed, the silence heavier than ever. Lion reached for Evra, but his touch felt tentative, unsure. She responded, but her body was stiff, unyielding. The moment stretched, awkward and unfulfilling. Afterward, they turned away from each other, each trapped in their own private world of doubt and regret. The rain had started again, a soft, mournful sound that seemed to echo the unspoken words trapped between them. The arrival of Intorn had been a catalyst, a force that had shaken the foundations of their carefully constructed reality. He had left behind a residue of unease, a nagging sense that something needed to change. But neither Lion nor Evra seemed willing to make the first move. The distance between them had grown wider, the silence deeper. And in the darkness, they both wondered how much longer they could continue to live this way, existing in parallel, each carrying their own unspoken burdens, waiting for a storm that might never break. Understood. This chapter will focus on increased emotional turbulence, influenced by external perspectives. Chapter 5, Whispers and Wonders in English, roughly 3,000 words. Chapter 5, whispers and wonders. The city was in one of its capricious moods that morning, bright sun one moment, veiled skies the next. Lion stood at the window, watching the light shift across the buildings, feeling as though the world itself couldn't decide which face to present. He hadn't slept well, in Torn's words still echoing in his mind. Don't let comfort become a cage. He was starting to feel the bars. Number Fat, the whispered seed. Evra met Fat for brunch, a ritual they'd kept alive since college. Fat had always been the pragmatic one, the voice of reason, the friend who saw the chessboard 3 moves ahead. So, how are things with Lion? Fat asked, stirring sugar into her cappuccino. Evra hesitated, glancing around the crowded cafe. Fine. The same. The same isn't always good, Fat countered, her eyes sharp. I saw him the other day, grabbing coffee near his office. Seemed preoccupied. Distant. Evra shrugged, trying to dismiss the unease that had already taken root. He's been stressed about work. Is he? Fat raised an eyebrow. Or is he just good at hiding things? Evra felt a prickle of defensiveness. What's that supposed to mean? Just remember what happened with Sarah, back in college? All those late nights at the library that turned out to be something else. The memory hit Evra like a cold splash of water. Sarah had been a classmate, bright and ambitious, the kind of woman who seemed to effortlessly attract attention. Lion had spent weeks working on a project with her, only for Evra to discover later that the work had involved far more than research papers. That was years ago, Evra said, her voice tight. People change. Do they? Fat leaned forward, her voice low. Or do they just refine their methods? Lion's a good guy, Evra, but he's always had a pattern. A way of drifting when things get too comfortable. Just keep your eyes open. Number Lion. A business maze at work, Lion found himself mired deeper in the quagmire of the Florence deal. Donatello called again, his voice tight with frustration. The investors are demanding more deliverables, earlier. They want proof of concept before they release any more funds. We're going to have to pull some serious rabbits out of hats. Lion spent the day buried in spreadsheets, trying to make the numbers work, trying to find a way to salvage the opportunity. But every solution seemed to lead to another dead end. The reality was sinking in, this wasn't just a risk, it was a gamble with increasingly long odds. By evening, he was exhausted, his head pounding, his vision blurred. He stared at the screen, the glowing numbers mocking him with their unwavering precision. What was he even fighting for? A chance to escape? Or just a way to prove something to himself? Number Evra colors in the rain. Evra went to the studio that evening, seeking refuge in her painting. But Fat's words kept circling in her mind, clouding her vision. She stared at the canvas, the colors seeming dull and lifeless. Was Lion drifting again? Was he already halfway out the door, seeking some new adventure, some new connection? She tried to focus on the brush strokes, to lose herself in the texture of the paint. But the doubt lingered, a cold weight in her chest. She thought of their shared history, of the easy intimacy they had once shared. Where had it gone? When had they stopped talking, stopped dreaming, stopped seeing each other? The rain started again, drumming against the studio window, a mournful rhythm that seemed to echo her own unease. She put down her brush, her hands trembling. She couldn't paint tonight. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine. Number Negotiating a future. When she got home, Lion was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a glass of whiskey. The air was thick with unspoken tension. How was the studio? He asked, his voice flat. Fine, she replied, her gaze fixed on the floor. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Evra knew that they couldn't keep avoiding the truth. They couldn't keep living in this state of suspended animation. We need to talk, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Lion looked up, his eyes guarded. About what? About us, she said, meeting his gaze. About what we want. About where we're going. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. What's there to talk about? We're fine, aren't we? The words hit her like a slap. No, Lion. We're not fine. We're barely even existing. We're living separate lives under the same roof. He stood up, pacing the small kitchen. What do you want from me, Evra? I'm doing the best I can. I want you to be honest, she said, her voice rising. I want you to tell me what's going on in your head. I want you to tell me what you're feeling. I don't know what you want me to say, he repeated, his voice laced with frustration. I want you to fight for us, she said, her eyes filling with tears. I want you to show me that you still care. He stopped pacing, staring at her with a mixture of confusion and anger. What makes you think I don't care? Because you're not here, she said, her voice breaking. You're here physically, but you're not really here. You're somewhere else, lost in your own thoughts, your own dreams. And I'm tired of being left behind. The silence that followed was deafening. The rain continued to fall outside, a relentless drumming that seemed to amplify the emptiness in the room. Lion finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to do, Evra. I feel like I'm drowning. Then swim, she said, her voice pleading. Swim back to me. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. For a moment, she thought he was going to say something real, something honest. But then the moment passed, and his expression hardened. I can't, he said finally. I just can't. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Evra felt her heart shatter. Then maybe, she said, her voice trembling, maybe we're done. All right. I'll craft Chapter 6, The Unspoken Truth in English, around 3,000 words in length. This will focus on the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, the continued evasion, and the deepening crisis for both characters. Chapter 6, The Unspoken Truth. The morning after felt like waking into a landscape after a storm. The air was clear, washed clean, but the trees were broken, the ground littered with debris. The rain had stopped, but the threat of more hung heavy in the air. Evra woke up first, the memory of the previous night's words raw in her mind. Maybe we're done. She looked at Lion, sleeping beside her, his face pale, his brow furrowed even in sleep. Had she really said it? Had she finally crossed the line they'd been dancing around for months? She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and went to the kitchen. The apartment felt cold and unfamiliar, as though she were a stranger in her own home. She made coffee, the ritual familiar but empty. Number Evra. The morning after, when Lion finally emerged, he avoided her gaze, his movements stiff, his words perfunctory. Morning, he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Morning, she replied, her voice quiet. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Evra tried to find the words to bridge the gap, to initiate the serious conversation they so desperately needed. Lion, she began, about last night, he cut her off, his voice sharp. Can we not do this right now? I have a huge day at work. The Florence deal is hanging by a thread. Evra's heart sank. He was doing it again, retreating, deflecting, using work as a shield. That's all you ever say anymore, Lion, she said, her voice rising. Work, work, work. It's like our entire life is just a background noise to your job. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. What do you want from me, Evra? I'm trying to provide for us. I'm trying to make something of myself. I want you to be present, she said, her voice trembling. I want you to be here with me. I want you to see me. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I can't do this right now, Evra. I just can't. Can we please just table this conversation until I have more time to breathe? She stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. Fine, Lion. Table it. But don't expect me to still be sitting at the table when you finally decide to show up. Lion rivalries and riddles at the office. The atmosphere was even more charged than usual. The investors were growing impatient, demanding more results, more quickly. Lion spent the day in a frenzy of meetings, calls, and frantic negotiations. Then, in the late afternoon, he received a cryptic message on his phone. Gob says hello. Enjoy the view from the bottom. The message sent a chill down his spine. Gob was a rival from his past, a ruthless competitor who had always seemed to be one step ahead. What did he mean by the view from the bottom? Was this a threat? A warning? Lion tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just paranoia. But the message lingered in his mind, adding to the growing sense of unease. Was the Florence deal doomed? Was he about to lose everything he'd been working toward? Evra, a canvas of grief. Evra went to the studio, seeking solace in her painting. But the colors seemed dull and lifeless, the canvas a blank slate of grief. She tried to force herself to paint, to express the emotions churning inside her. But the brush felt heavy, her hand clumsy. She stared at the canvas, her mind filled with images of her life with Lion, the good times, the bad times, the moments of connection, the long stretches of silence. Had it all been a lie? Had they ever really loved each other? The tears started to flow, hot and heavy, blurring her vision. She dropped the brush, her body shaking with sobs. She couldn't paint. She couldn't pretend. She couldn't keep living this way. Intimacy's failure that night. They went through the motions of intimacy, their bodies moving together in familiar patterns. But the connection was gone, the spark extinguished. Lion's touch felt distant, perfunctory. Evra's responses were forced, unenthusiastic. Afterward, they lay in bed, the silence heavier than ever. Lion turned away from her, his breathing shallow. Evra stared at the ceiling, her eyes dry, her heart numb. The physical intimacy had failed to bridge the emotional gap. It had only served to highlight the emptiness between them. They were strangers in the same bed, their bodies disconnected, their hearts miles apart. The unspoken truth. As they lay there in the darkness, Evra knew that something had to change. They couldn't keep living this way, existing in a state of perpetual limbo. They needed to face the truth, however painful it might be. She turned to Lion, her voice barely a whisper. Lion, she said, we need to talk. He didn't respond. His breathing was slow, even. He was asleep. Or pretending to be. Evra stared at his back, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud that threatened to engulf them both. She closed her eyes. Understood. The goal now is to have outside interactions begin to fuel inner turmoil and decision-making. Here is Chapter 7, A Spark of Jealousy in English, approximately 3,000 words in length. Chapter 7, A Spark of Jealousy. The tension in the apartment had become a palpable entity, a silent roommate that occupied every corner, every interaction. Evra found herself increasingly avoiding Lion, retreating into her own world of art and work, finding solace in the vibrant energy of her colleagues. Lion, meanwhile, threw himself even more fiercely into the Florence deal, driven by a mixture of ambition and a desperate need to prove himself. Julie, the unexpected affirmation at the non-profit. Evra found herself drawn to Julie, a younger colleague with a contagious enthusiasm for art and life. Julie saw the potential in Evra's work that Lion seemed to have overlooked, offering encouragement and perspective that she desperately craved. Your piece is incredible, Evra, Julie said, her eyes shining. It's got this raw, emotional honesty that just grabs you. You've got to showcase it properly. Evra smiled, a genuine smile that hadn't reached her face in weeks. "Thanks, Julie. That means a lot." "Seriously," Julie continued. "You should think about entering some competitions, maybe even doing a solo show. You've got the talent, Evra. You just need to believe in yourself." Julie's words resonated with Evra, igniting a spark of hope that had been dormant for too long. She realized how much she missed having someone believe in her, someone who saw her potential and encouraged her to pursue her dreams. Lion. Fueled by envy. One evening, Lion arrived home earlier than usual, only to find Evra laughing with Julie in the kitchen, their voices animated, their faces glowing. He felt a surge of jealousy, a possessive anger that surprised him. "Hey," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Didn't know we were having a party." Evra and Julie turned to face him, their expressions shifting from warmth to wariness. "Oh, hi, Lion," Evra said, her tone cool. "Julie was just giving me some feedback on my painting." "Right," Lion said, his gaze fixed on Julie. "Always good to get feedback." He felt like an outsider, excluded from their intimate world. He couldn't help but compare Julie's vibrant energy to his own exhaustion and self-doubt. He realized that he hadn't been offering Evra the encouragement and support she needed, and someone else had stepped in to fill the void. The realization fueled his ambition, pushing him to pursue the Florence deal even more aggressively. He wanted to prove to Evra, and to himself, that he was capable of more, that he could provide her with the life she deserved. Aggressive pursuits. Lion's increased drive began to manifest in rash decisions and high-stakes negotiations. He was bordering on reckless, desperate to secure the deal. He stayed late at the office, neglecting his health and his relationship, consumed by the need to succeed. Donatello, noticing Lion's increasingly erratic behavior, tried to offer a word of caution. "Easy, Lion," he said. "Don't let this thing consume you. It's just business." "It's more than just business, Donatello," Lion replied, his voice tight. "It's about proving something." "Proving what?" Donatello asked, his eyes narrowed. "That I'm not a failure," Lion said, his voice barely a whisper. Doubts rise. Evra, meanwhile, watched Lion's increasingly frantic efforts with a mixture of concern and detachment. She saw him pushing himself to the brink, sacrificing everything for a deal that seemed increasingly precarious. She couldn't help but wonder if he was doing it for her, or for himself. Was he trying to build a future for them, or was he just trying to escape the present? One evening, she found him hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot. "Lion," she said, her voice soft, "you need to take a break. You're going to burn yourself out." He barely looked up, his fingers still flying across the keyboard. "I can't, Evra. I'm too close. I can feel it." She sighed, her heart sinking. "What about us, Lion? Are we too close, too? Can you feel that?" He stopped typing, his gaze finally meeting hers. "What do you want me to say, Evra?" he asked, his voice weary. "I want you to see me," she said, her voice trembling. "I want you to want me. I want you to help me realize my potential." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and longing. "I don't know if I can, Evra," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm the man you need." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. Evra realized that she had reached a breaking point. She couldn't keep waiting for Lion to become the man she needed. She had to take control of her own life, her own future. A choice approaches. As Lion continued his relentless pursuit of the Florence deal, Evra began to explore her own artistic opportunities, spurred on by Julie's encouragement. She started to question whether Lion could truly support her dreams, whether he was capable of seeing her for who she was, not just who he wanted her to be. The spark of jealousy that had ignited in Lion's heart had also ignited a spark of independence in Evra's soul. And as they both pursued their separate paths, they drifted further and further apart, their relationship hanging precariously in the balance. Understood. I will lean into the building pressure by having Lion's professional inability directly contrast with Evra's personal expressions. This will be Chapter 8, the business pitch in English, at approximately 3,000 words. Chapter 8, the business pitch. The air in the sterile conference room was thick with anticipation. Lion sat across from the investors, his palms sweating, his tie feeling tighter than ever. This was at the culmination of weeks of frantic work, the moment to pitch his vision for the Florence deal and secure the funding that would make it all a reality. But as he began to speak, the words seemed to catch in his throat. He struggled to articulate his ideas, his voice sounding hollow and unconvincing. He felt a block in his mind, a wall that prevented him from expressing the passion and vision that he knew was there. Lion. Silence under pressure. The investors listened politely, but their expressions were unreadable. Lion could feel their skepticism, their doubt. He stumbled over his words, losing his train of thought, failing to convey the brilliance of his strategy. He tried to regain control, to force the words to come, but the more he tried, the more elusive they became. He felt like he was drowning, grasping for air, but finding only silence. The meeting stretched on, the tension building with each passing minute. Lion knew that he was losing them, that the deal was slipping through his fingers. But he was powerless to stop it. He was trapped in his own mind, unable to break free. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the meeting came to an end. The investors thanked him for his time, their words polite but non-committal. Lion knew that it was over. He had failed. Evra, confessions to a colleague. Meanwhile, at the non-profit, Evra was confiding in Julie about her frustrations with Lion. They were sitting in the break room, sipping lukewarm coffee, the air filled with the scent of stale pastries. I don't know what to do, Julie, Evra said, her voice heavy with despair. I feel like I'm losing him. He's so focused on this deal, he doesn't even see me anymore. Julie listened patiently, her eyes filled with empathy. Have you tried talking to him? She asked. I've tried, Evra said, shaking her head. But he just shuts down. He says he's stressed, that he needs to focus, that we can talk later. But later never comes. Maybe he's scared, Julie suggested. Maybe he's afraid of failing, afraid of not being good enough for you. Maybe, Evra said, her voice barely audible. But I can't keep waiting for him to figure it out. I need someone who's present, someone who sees me, someone who wants to be with me. She began to tear up and Julie hugged her. I know it's hard, Evra, Julie said and paused. But you deserve to be happy. You deserve someone who appreciates you, someone who supports your dreams. Evra nodded, wiping away her tears. I know, she said. But it's just so hard to let go. Strange deeds multiply. Lion returned to the apartment, defeated and exhausted. He found Evra sitting in the living room, sketching in her notebook. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. How did it go? Evra asked, her voice guarded. Lion avoided her gaze, his face flushed with shame. It didn't go well, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I messed it up. Evra closed her notebook, her expression softening with concern. What happened? She asked. Lion hesitated, unsure how to explain his failure. I just couldn't articulate my vision, he said finally. I couldn't find the words. Evra stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and frustration. Maybe, she said, her voice quiet, maybe that's because you don't really have a vision. Maybe you're just chasing a dream that isn't yours. Her words hit him like a slap. He wanted to deny them, to defend himself, but he knew that she was right. He had been chasing a dream that wasn't his, a dream that had led him further and further away from the things that truly mattered. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Lion felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had failed at his business venture, and he was failing at his relationship. He had lost his way, and he didn't know how to find his way back. He looked at Evra, her face etched with sadness, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and disappointment. He knew that he had hurt her, that he had let her down. And he didn't know if he could ever make it right. He wanted to reach out to her, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. He was still trapped in his own mind, unable to break free. The weight of their unspoken truths pressed down on them, crushing them under its weight. They were living separate lives under the same roof, their relationship crumbling before their eyes. And they were both powerless to stop it. Okay, this is where we bring in outside perspective to act as a catalyst for final decisions. Here's your Chapter 9, The Intervention of Fate in English, at approximately 3,000 words, number Chapter 9, The Intervention of Fate. The small apartment felt even smaller than usual, burdened by the weight of unspoken words and mounting regrets. Lion moved through the rooms like a ghost, avoiding Evra's gaze, haunted by his failure to secure the Florence deal. Evra, in turn, found herself increasingly drawn to the studio, seeking refuge in her art, finding solace in the company of Julie and the other artists. Then, one afternoon, Fate arrived. Number Fate, the knowing elder Fate was an old friend of Evra's family, a woman of quiet wisdom and unwavering strength. She had known Evra since she was a child, and had always been a source of guidance and support. Fate had a way of seeing through pretense, of cutting to the heart of the matter with a gentle but firm hand. Evra opened the door to find Fate standing on the doorstep, her face etched with a knowing smile. "Evra, child," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "I felt a shift in the air. I thought I would come and see if you needed a cup of tea and an old woman's advice." Evra's heart lifted at the sight of Fate. She knew that Fate would see through their carefully constructed facade, that she would sense the discord that had taken root in their home. But she also knew that Fate's presence would be a source of comfort and strength. Number Sensing the unrest as soon as Fate stepped inside, she sensed the tension that permeated the apartment. She glanced at Lion, who stood awkwardly in the corner, avoiding her gaze. She looked at Evra, whose face was etched with sadness. "Something is not right here," Fate said, her voice quiet but firm. "Tell me what is happening, children. Do not hide from me. I have seen more storms than both of you have lived through." Evra and Lion exchanged a nervous glance. They knew that they couldn't hide the truth from Fate. She would see through their lies, no matter how carefully constructed. Evra finally broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "We're not doing well, Fate," she said. "We're drifting apart. We don't talk anymore. We don't connect." Lion remained silent, his head bowed in shame. Fate nodded, her expression softening with compassion. "I see," she said. "And what is the cause of this drifting, Lion? What has taken your attention away from this beautiful woman who loves you?" Lion hesitated, unsure how to answer. He didn't want to admit his failure, his ambition, his fear. But he knew that he couldn't lie to Fate. "I've been chasing a dream," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I've been trying to make something of myself, to prove that I'm not a failure." Fate nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "And what is this dream, Lion? Is it worth sacrificing the love and happiness that you have found with Evra?" Lion remained silent, his head bowed in shame. Number Words of truth. Fate turned to Evra, her expression softening with concern. "And what about you, child?" she asked. "What have you been doing while Lion has been chasing his dream? Have you been waiting for him to return? Have you been putting your own life on hold?" Evra shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I've been trying to be patient," she said. I've been trying to support him. But it's been hard, Fady. I feel like he doesn't see me anymore. I feel like he doesn't care. Fady reached out and took Evra's hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. My dear, she said, you cannot wait for a man to change. You cannot put your life on hold waiting for him to become the person you need him to be. You must live your own life, pursue your own dreams, and find your own happiness. If he is meant to be a part of your journey, he will find his way back to you. But you cannot wait for him. You must keep moving forward. She turned back to Lion, her expression stern. And you, Lion, she said, you must wake up. You must see what you are losing. You must decide what is truly important to you. Is it this dream that you are chasing, or is it the love and happiness that you have found with Evra? You cannot have both. You must choose. Planting seeds. Fady stayed for several hours, offering her wisdom and support, encouraging both Lion and Evra to speak their truth, to confront their fears, to make a decision about their future. She told them stories of her own life, of the challenges she had faced, of the choices she had made. She reminded them of the importance of honesty, of communication, of forgiveness. As she prepared to leave, she turned to Lion and Evra, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and concern. The path ahead will not be easy, she said. But you are both strong, and you are both capable of making the right choices. Listen to your hearts, speak your truth, and have faith in the future. Whatever happens, remember that you are both worthy of love and happiness. With that, she embraced them both, her touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Then, she turned and walked out the door, leaving them alone with her words, with their thoughts, with their fears. Aftermath. The apartment felt different after Fady left, as though a weight had been lifted. Lion and Evra looked at each other, their expressions guarded, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They knew that they had a decision to make, a choice that would determine the course of their lives. They could continue down the path they were on, drifting further and further apart, until there was nothing left to salvage. Or they could try to find their way back to each other, to rebuild their relationship, to create a future together. The choice was theirs. And the clock was ticking. All right, here is Chapter 10, the English test in English, approximately 3,000 words. Chapter 10, the English test. The morning after Fady's visit hung heavy with a sense of impending change. The air in the apartment felt both lighter and more precarious, as if a long-held dam had sprung a leak, and the rising waters were about to reshape the landscape of their lives. Lion woke with a knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach, the memory of Fady's probing questions lingering like a phantom limb. The unexpected obstacle. He had decided, against all better judgment, to keep pursuing the Florence opportunity, driven by a stubborn need to prove himself, even if it meant risking everything. But there was a new hurdle, one he hadn't anticipated. The consultancy required a near-native fluency in English. An English proficiency test. The thought filled him with dread. He had studied English in school, of course, but his knowledge was largely theoretical, gleaned from textbooks and grammar exercises. He had never been comfortable speaking the language, never felt the confidence to express himself with the same nuance and passion he could in his native tongue. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the practice test on his laptop, the words swimming before his eyes. Complex sentence structures, idiomatic expressions, subtle nuances of meaning. It all felt overwhelming, impossible. He knew that he was going to fail. A bridge of language. Evra found him hunched over the laptop, his brow furrowed, his face etched with frustration. She had been trying to give him space, to allow him to grapple with his own demons, but she couldn't bear to see him struggling like this. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft. Lion looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and desperation. "I have to take an English test," he said, his voice barely audible. "I need to pass it to get the Florence deal." Evra's expression softened with sympathy. She knew how much this opportunity meant to him, even if she questioned his motives. "Let me help," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm pretty good at English. I can tutor you." Lion hesitated, reluctant to accept her help, unwilling to admit his vulnerability. But he knew that he had no other choice. He needed her. A shared struggle for the next few hours. They worked together, side by side at the kitchen table. Evra patiently explained grammar rules, corrected his pronunciation, and helped him decipher complex sentence structures. Lion struggled at first, his frustration mounting with each mistake. But Evra remained calm and encouraging, praising his progress, gently correcting his errors. As they worked together, a sense of camaraderie began to develop between them. They laughed at his awkward pronunciation, shared stories of their own struggles with language, and found a common ground in their shared effort. Evra was surprised by Lion's willingness to learn, his determination to overcome his fear. She saw a side of him she hadn't seen in a long time, a vulnerability that touched her heart. Lion, in turn, was touched by Evra's patience and support. He realized how much he had taken her for granted, how much he had missed her warmth and her humor. Intimacies return. As the afternoon wore on, the boundaries between teacher and student began to blur. They found themselves leaning closer, their bodies touching, their hands brushing. The air in the kitchen grew thick with unspoken desire. They took a break from studying, standing up and stretching, their bodies moving in unison. Lion reached out and touched Evra's face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her lips parting. They kissed, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of longing and regret. Their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating in unison. It was a kiss that promised a return to intimacy, a rekindling of the passion that had once burned so brightly between them. Elusive truth. They made love that night, their bodies moving together with a desperate hunger, a need to reconnect, to rediscover the intimacy they had lost. But even as their bodies found solace in each other's arms, their hearts remained distant, their minds filled with unspoken questions. Afterward, they lay in bed, tangled in the sheets, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Lion reached out and touched Evra's hand, his fingers tracing the lines of her palm. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "For helping me today. For being here." Evra squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sadness. "I'll always be here for you, Lion," she said. "But you have to meet me halfway. You have to open up. You have to tell me what's really going on inside your head." Lion hesitated, his face clouding with doubt. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess his fears, to admit his failures. But the words wouldn't come. He was still trapped in his own mind, unable to break free. He looked at Evra, her face etched with longing, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. He knew that he was hurting her, that he was holding her back. But he couldn't help himself. He was a prisoner of his own silence, unable to express the truth that lay buried deep within his heart. "Okay. This will ramp up the pressure and make the choice at the end even more pivotal. Here's Chapter 11, The Lure of the Unknown in English, approximately 3,000 words. Chapter 11, The Lure of the Unknown. The brief flicker of connection rekindled during the English test had faded, leaving behind a residue of longing and regret. Lion and Evra continued to move through their days like ships passing in the night, their shared apartment feeling more like a temporary port than a home. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on them, suffocating their attempts at intimacy, poisoning their attempts at conversation. A tempting offer. Then, Donatello called. "I've got something for you," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "It's not Florence, but it's interesting. And lucrative. Very lucrative." Lion met Donatello at a dimly lit bar downtown, the air thick with the scent of stale beer and desperation. Donatello slid a file across the table, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. It's a project for a client in Dubai, he said. They're looking for someone with your skills to massage some numbers, let's say. Make things look a little more appealing to investors. Lion hesitated, his brow furrowed. You mean, lie? Donatello shrugged, his expression nonchalant. Let's just say they're looking for someone who's good at creative accounting. The pay is astronomical. Enough to set you up for life. Lion stared at the file, his mind racing. He knew that it was wrong, that it was unethical, possibly even illegal. But the temptation was overwhelming. He was desperate to escape the rut he was in, to prove himself, to provide for Evra. What's the catch? He asked, his voice barely audible. The catch is, it's not exactly legal, Donatello said, his eyes narrowing. You'd have to be willing to turn a blind eye to some things. You'd have to be willing to get your hands a little dirty. Lion hesitated, his conscience warring with his ambition. He knew that this was a crossroads, a moment that would define the rest of his life. If he took this job, he would be crossing a line that he could never uncross. Evra's growing doubts. Meanwhile, Evra was wrestling with her own doubts about their relationship. She found herself increasingly drawn to Julie, drawn to her energy, her passion, her unwavering belief in Evra's talent. One evening, as they were leaving the studio together, Julie turned to Evra, her eyes filled with concern. You seem distracted lately, she said. Is everything okay? Evra hesitated, unsure how to answer. She didn't want to burden Julie with her problems, but she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I don't know what to do, Julie, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I feel like I'm living a lie. I'm not happy with Lion, but I don't know how to leave. I'm scared of being alone. Julie reached out and took Evra's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. You're not alone, Evra, she said. You have me, you have your friends, you have your art. You're strong, Evra. You can do this. Her words resonated with Evra, giving her the courage to confront her fears, to make a decision about her future. She realized that she couldn't keep living this way, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of a relationship that was no longer fulfilling. Morally strange choices. Lion returned to the apartment late that night, his mind racing, his conscience tormented. He found Evra sitting in the living room, sketching in her notebook. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. Where have you been? Evra asked, her voice guarded. Lion hesitated, unsure how to answer. He didn't want to tell her about Donatello's offer, didn't want to burden her with his moral dilemma. I was out, he said, his voice barely audible. I had some things to take care of. Evra stared at him, her eyes filled with suspicion. What things? She asked. Lion avoided her gaze, his face flushing with shame. It's nothing, he said. Just work stuff. Evra sighed, her expression softening with concern. Lion, she said, you need to talk to me. I can see that something's bothering you. I want to help. Lion hesitated, his conscience warring with his desire to protect her. He knew that he should tell her the truth, that he should share his burden with her. But he was afraid of what she would think, afraid of her judgment, afraid of losing her. I can't, Evra, he said, his voice barely audible. It's too complicated. You wouldn't understand. Evra stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. Maybe you're right, Lion, she said, her voice quiet. Maybe I don't understand you anymore. Maybe we've grown too far apart. Her words hit him like a slap, forcing him to confront the reality of their situation. He was losing her, pushing her away with his secrets, his lies, his morally questionable choices. And he didn't know how to stop. Okay, here's your penultimate chapter that will build up to the final decision in the next chapter. Here's chapter 12, A Night Out in English, approximately 3,000 words. Chapter 12, A night out. The small apartment felt like a cage, the silence amplifying the unspoken tension that had taken root between them. Evra found herself yearning for connection, for laughter, for the kind of vibrant energy that had been absent from her life for far too long. Then, Julie called. "We're going out tonight," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "A new gallery opened downtown, and all the cool kids are going to be there. You coming?" Evra hesitated, glancing at Lion, who was hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, his face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. "I don't know, Julie," she said. "Lion's been stressed lately. I don't want to leave him alone." "He'll be fine," Julie countered. "He needs to figure out his own stuff. You need to live your life, Evra. You deserve a night out." Evra thought for a moment, her heart warring with her sense of obligation. She knew that Julie was right, that she couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of a relationship that was no longer fulfilling. "Okay," she said, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. "I'm in." New connections. Julie met Evra outside the gallery, her face beaming with excitement. "You look amazing," she exclaimed, admiring Evra's dress. "I knew you needed this." The gallery was buzzing with energy, filled with artists, collectors, and people who simply wanted to be seen. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition. Julie introduced Evra to a charming man named Arnold, a writer with a quick wit and a genuine interest in art. Arnold engaged Evra in lively conversation, asking her about her work, her dreams, her passions. He listened intently, his eyes filled with admiration. Evra found herself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in months. She felt a spark of connection with Arnold, a sense of ease and understanding that had been missing from her relationship with Lion for far too long. They talked for hours, discussing art, literature, and life. Evra found herself opening up, sharing her thoughts and feelings with a candor she hadn't realized she possessed. She felt seen, she felt heard, she felt alive. As the evening wore on, Evra realized how much she had missed this kind of connection, how much she had sacrificed in her relationship with Lion. She had allowed herself to become isolated, to become defined by his ambitions, to lose sight of her own dreams. But tonight, she was reclaiming her own identity, rediscovering her own passions, finding her own voice. A solitary reflection. Meanwhile, Lion sat alone in the apartment, staring out the window, his mind filled with turmoil. He had declined Donatello's offer, his conscience finally outweighing his ambition. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the wrong decision. He looked up at the night sky, the stars twinkling like distant diamonds. He felt small, insignificant, a tiny speck in the vast expanse of the universe. What was he doing with his life? Was he truly happy? Was he truly fulfilled? Or was he just drifting, lost in a sea of meaningless pursuits? He thought of Evra, of her warmth, her beauty, her talent. He realized how much he had taken her for granted, how much he had neglected her needs, how much he had hurt her. He knew that he had to change, that he had to become the man she deserved. But he didn't know how. He didn't know if it was too late. Worlds apart. As Evra laughed and danced with Arnold at the gallery, Lion sat alone in the darkness, contemplating the vastness of the universe. Their worlds had become so far apart, their paths diverging in ways that seemed impossible to reconcile. Evra's newfound empowerment contrasted sharply with Lion's solitary contemplation. She was embracing life, reclaiming her identity, finding her voice. He was mired in self-doubt, haunted by his failures, paralyzed by his fears. And as they both moved through their separate lives, the future of their relationship hung precariously in the balance, teetering on the edge of a cliff, poised to either soar or plummet into the abyss. Okay, let's set this up for a more dramatic, and potentially irreversible, final choice. Here is Chapter 13, The Jealousy Escalates in English. at approximately 3,000 words in length. Number Chapter 13, The jealousy escalates. Evra returned to the apartment late that night, her face flushed with excitement, her heart still buzzing from the energy of the gallery. She found Lion waiting for her, his expression dark, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and suspicion. The air in the apartment crackled with unspoken tension, the silence amplifying the unspoken accusations that hung between them. Number A confrontation masked as concern. Where were you? Lion asked, his voice sharp, barely concealing his jealousy. It's late. I was worried. Evra's smile faltered, her excitement replaced by a surge of irritation. She knew what he was doing, masking his jealousy as concern, trying to control her, to guilt her into submission. I was out, she said, her voice guarded. With Julie. We went to a gallery opening. Lion's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. And who's this Arnold guy? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Did you meet him at the gallery too? Evra's temper flared, her patience finally snapping. What is this, Lion? She demanded. Are you interrogating me? I'm allowed to have friends, you know. I'm allowed to have a life. I'm just concerned, Lion countered, his voice laced with false concern. I just want to know who you're spending your time with. You don't get to dictate who I spend my time with, Lion, Evra retorted, her voice rising. I'm not your property. I'm an independent woman, and I'm going to live my life the way I see fit. Lion stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. He realized that he was losing her, that his attempts to control her were only pushing her further away. Number A decision made in secret. Then, Lion changed his mind. He called Donatello. He was in. The die was cast, his fate sealed. All that remained was to tell Evra. Number An argument without truth. The argument escalated, their voices rising, their words becoming sharper and more hurtful. Evra accused Lion of being controlling, of being emotionally distant, of being incapable of truly loving her. Lion accused Evra of being selfish, of being ungrateful, of being incapable of understanding his ambitions. Both were speaking from raw emotions, neither was expressing what was truly happening. I'm tired of this, Lion, Evra said, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of trying to make this work when you're not even willing to meet me halfway. Lion stared at her, his heart filled with a mixture of pain and regret. He knew that she was right, that he had been failing her, that he had been pushing her away with his secrets and his lies. He opened his mouth to speak, to confess his decision to work with Donatello in Dubai, to tell her about his moral struggles, to beg for her forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. He was still trapped in his own mind, unable to break free. He began, his voice barely audible. Just stop, Lion, Evra interrupted, her voice filled with weariness. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear any more excuses. I'm done. She turned and walked away, leaving Lion standing alone in the middle of the apartment, his heart filled with a mixture of despair and resignation. He knew that he had reached the point of no return, that he had finally destroyed the last vestige of hope for their relationship. Number Chapter 14, Consequences of Secrecy. The days that followed were marked by an unbearable silence, a chasm widening between Lion and Evra with each passing hour. The apartment, once a haven of shared dreams and whispered intimacies, now felt like a battleground of unspoken resentments. The air was thick with the weight of what wasn't being said, each avoiding the other's gaze, their movements careful, almost choreographed, to prevent any accidental collisions that might force them to confront the gaping wound in their relationship. Number Lion's descent. Lion, consumed by his decision to accept Donatello's offer, became increasingly withdrawn, his eyes haunted by a mixture of guilt and feverish ambition. The Dubai project had become an all-consuming obsession, a dark secret that gnawed at his conscience, forcing him to erect walls around himself, shutting out Evra, shutting out the world. He spent hours hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard, manipulating numbers, crafting deceptive narratives, all in the service of his client's dubious agenda. The more enmeshed he became in the project, the more detached he grew from reality, his moral compass spinning wildly, unable to find its true north. He knew that he was hurting Evra, that his secrecy and distance were driving her away, but he felt powerless to stop himself. He was trapped in a cycle of self-destruction, his ambition blinding him to the consequences of his actions. He tried to justify his choices, telling himself that he was doing it for her, that he was building a future for them, a future of financial security and endless possibilities. But deep down, he knew that he was lying to himself, that he was sacrificing their relationship on the altar of his own ego. Evra's sanctuary. Evra, sensing Lion's growing distance and sensing his moral deterioration, retreated into her own world, seeking solace in her art, finding strength in her newfound independence. The studio became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of the apartment, a place where she could express the emotions that she could no longer voice. She threw herself into her work with a renewed passion, her canvases becoming a reflection of her inner turmoil, her brush strokes capturing the pain, the anger, the longing that churned within her. She painted vibrant colors, bold shapes, abstract forms that spoke of her yearning for freedom, her desire to break free from the constraints of her relationship, to forge her own path. She spent hours talking to Julie, confiding in her about her fears, her doubts, her hopes for the future. Julie listened patiently, offering her unwavering support, encouraging her to embrace her own strength, to trust her own instincts. Number 2 Separate worlds. The apartment, once a symbol of their shared dreams, now stood as a stark reminder of their diverging paths. They occupied the same physical space, but they lived in two separate emotional worlds, their hearts growing further apart with each passing day. They shared meals in silence, their eyes avoiding each other's gaze, their conversations reduced to perfunctory exchanges about the weather or the broken washing machine. They slept in the same bed, but their bodies remained distant, their touch lacking the warmth and intimacy that had once defined their connection. They were strangers in the same home, their love replaced by a cold, hollow silence. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing heavy with the weight of their unspoken resentments, their unfulfilled dreams. The final decision. One evening, Eva returned to the apartment to find Lion packing a suitcase. The sight of it sent a jolt of cold dread through her. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Lion looked up, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice flat. "I'm going to Dubai." Evra stared at him, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She had known that this was coming, that their relationship was doomed, but hearing the words spoken aloud, seeing the finality of his decision, was like a physical blow. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're just giving up? You're just walking away?" Lion nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I don't know what else to do, Evra," he said. "I'm not the man you need. I'm not capable of making you happy." Evra stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. She watched as Lion finished packing his suitcase, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. He picked up the suitcase and turned to face her, his expression filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. "Goodbye, Evra," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll always love you." With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Evra standing alone in the middle of the apartment, the silence echoing around her like a mournful dirge. She stood there for a long time, her body numb, her mind blank. Then, slowly, she began to cry, tears streaming down her face, tears of grief, tears of anger, tears of relief. Lion has made his choice, and it is over. This is the end. Chapter 15 The truth about Donatello. Scene 1 A bachelor's apartment of regret. Lion's apartment had never felt larger than it did the day after Evra left. Not because it actually grew, though rival Gob swore the walls had expanded to punish him, but because emptiness has a way of amplifying every sound. The drip of the leaky faucet became a timpani. The creak of the radiator, a ghostly violin. And Lion's own sighs, an orchestra of regret. He wandered through the rooms, suitcase still half-packed, staring at the mug Evra had left behind, a ridiculous, oversized cup with a painted cat grinning on its side. He picked it up like Hamlet with Yorick's skull. To be ambitious, or not to be ambitious, he muttered. That is the question. The mug, of course, offered no answer. But Gob did. Scene 2. Gob's grand entrance. Rival Gob burst in without knocking. He claimed legal rights to ignore doors on the grounds of being a freelance prophet. The neighbors no longer protested, they merely sighed, adjusted their earplugs, and prepared popcorn. Lion! Gob thundered, arms full of mismatched papers. I bring salvation wrapped in bureaucracy. Donatello is a fraud. Lion didn't even look up. Gob, you could at least pretend to text first. I don't text. Texting is for cowards and dentists. Plenty of brave dentists exist. Name one. Lion opened his mouth, failed, and closed it again. Gob grinned in triumph. See? Fraudulent. Just like Donatello. Scene 3. Gob's evidence. Round 1. Gob laid his papers across the table. At first glance, they looked important. On second glance, they were menus from a shawarma stand. On third glance, they were important again, because Gob had written accusations in red marker across the margins: shrimp hoarder. Launders money through falafel oil. Suspicious mustache curvature. Lion groaned. You call this evidence? Gob jabbed a finger at the word falafel. You see the pattern? No, that's because you're blinded by ambition. The neighbors leaned against the wall, whispering, better than Netflix. Scene 4. Lion's phone call. Unable to convince Gob otherwise, Lion grabbed his phone and dialed Donatello himself. Ah, my brilliant protégé. Donatello's voice purred through the receiver, oiled with charm. Are you ready for Dubai? The sand, the skyscrapers, the eternal buffet shrimp. Gob's eyes widened at the last word. See. Shrimp? Lion turned away, embarrassed. Sir, there are rumors. Some say you're. He lowered his voice. A fraud. Donatello laughed so loudly the phone nearly cracked. My dear boy, fraud is such a boring word. I prefer creative liquidity. Creative liquidity. Lion repeated. Yes. It means the money is like water. It flows. Sometimes into my pocket. Sometimes out of yours. Very spiritual. Lion, gullible as ever, nodded. That does sound profound. Gob collapsed dramatically on the floor. We're doomed. Scene 5. Evra in her studio. Meanwhile, Evra was in her studio across town. Freedom suited her. She wore overalls splattered with 10 layers of dried paint, hair tied in a messy bun, eyes sparkling with determination. Beside her stood Julie, armed with cookies and unsolicited advice. You're better off, Julie declared, munching loudly. Lion was turning into an Excel spreadsheet with legs. Evra smirked. He always did talk about numbers more than feelings. She dipped her brush into cobalt blue. It's strange, though. I don't miss him. I miss who he was, before Donatello poisoned him with shrimp and secrecy. Then paint it, Julie said. Paint the loss. Paint the fraud. Paint, a giant shrimp eating a skyscraper. Evra laughed so hard she nearly spilled her paint. You're ridiculous. But it sells. Trust me, collectors love metaphorical seafood. Scene 6. The neighbors chorus. Back at Lion's building, the neighbors had formed a gossip circle. They were like a Greek chorus but with cheaper wine. Mrs. Kowalski, I hear Donatello steals people's socks while they sleep. Mr. Henderson, nonsense. He buys socks in bulk, launders them for profit. Teenager from 3B, you're both wrong. He's starting a sock-based cryptocurrency. They laughed, they speculated, they made bets. The building had never been livelier. Lion's tragedy was their sitcom. Scene 7 Gob's evidence, Round 2 Not giving up. Gob created a PowerPoint presentation. He projected it on Lion's bare wall. Slide 1, Donatello is evil, font, Comic Sans, neon pink. Slide 2, a badly photoshopped picture of Donatello shaking hands with a raccoon. Slide 3, correlation between shrimp and fraud, illustrated with pie charts. Actual pies. Gob had glued photos of pies. Lion pinched the bridge of his nose. Gob, this isn't evidence. It's a bake sale. Every pie tells a story. Gob insisted. The neighbors applauded. Scene 8 Lion's dreams that night. Lion dreamed of Dubai. But it wasn't glamorous. In the dream, he wore a suit made of receipts, chased by giant shrimp-wielding calculators. Donatello rode on their backs, laughing maniacally. He woke in a sweat. Gob sat in a chair beside his bed, holding binoculars. Gob! Lion shouted. Why are you watching me sleep? Research. Scene 9 Evra's new painting. Evra unveiled her latest canvas to Julie, a surreal landscape of skyscrapers melting into an ocean of cocktail sauce. In the middle, a faceless man clutched a suitcase overflowing with Monopoly money. It's brilliant, Julie said. Call it the fraudulent feast. Evra smiled faintly. Maybe one day Lion will see it and understand. Julie snorted. Or he'll think it's an ad for seafood. Scene 10 Gob vs Donatello. Gob, determined to end this once and for all, phoned Donatello directly. Sir, Gob growled, I know your game. Donatello chuckled. Do you? Because even I don't always know my game. You manipulate shrimp prices, don't you? There was a pause. Then, Donatello whispered, maybe. Gob nearly fainted with vindication. I knew it. Scene 11 Lion's stubbornness. Despite everything, Lion packed again. He ignored Gob's rants, Evra's absence, the neighbors' gossip. I must go to Dubai, he declared. It's my destiny. Gob clung to his leg. It's your downfall. Lion shook him off. History will remember me. History will laugh at you. Gob shot back. The neighbors clapped again. Curtain call. Scene 12 Evra's quiet strength. Across town, Evra locked her studio and walked into the night air. She felt lighter. No longer chained to Lion's secrecy, she was free to pursue her art, her independence, her own eccentric future. She whispered to herself, smiling, good luck, Lion. You'll need it. Epilogue of irony. Lion clung to Donatello. Gob clung to his shrimp theories. Evra clung to her brushes. And the neighbors clung to the entertainment of it all. The truth about Donatello was absurd, undeniable, and dangerously comical. But Lion wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. And so, the story stretched on, half tragedy, half slapstick, an endless comedy of ambition, fraud, shrimp, and broken hearts. Chapter 16 Evra's realization. Evra had always prided herself on her perceptiveness, but the truth about Lion had arrived like a cannonball in a porcelain shop, loud, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. She had spent the morning in her studio, her brushes hovering over a canvas, half-finished swirls of color that, until this moment, were meant to capture the quiet joy of creation. Now they seemed inadequate, small, and helpless, to depict the enormity of what she had just realized. Lion had been deceiving her, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of betrayal. She set down her brush and wiped her hands on her paint-stained apron. Julie, ever the optimist and collector of absurdly unnecessary advice, perched on a stool nearby, watching the storm gather in Evra's eyes. He's been lying to you, Julie said gently, as if whispering a secret, though it was hardly a secret. And you deserve honesty. Evra clenched her fists, both in frustration and determination. Not just honesty, she murmured. Complete honesty. No excuses, no half-truths, no ridiculous justifications. I need everything laid bare, or I can't trust him again. Julie nodded solemnly. Then it's time. Confrontation is the first step toward reconciliation, or comedy. Hopefully reconciliation. It was almost noon when Evra arrived at Lion's apartment. The city had not changed, but somehow the air felt heavier, as if it knew that monumental events were about to unfold behind the modest door of his flat. She took a deep breath, adjusted her bag, and knocked once firmly, decisively. The knock echoed in a way that suggested destiny was listening. Lion, who had been sprawled across his couch in a state of existential disarray, perked up at the sound. His hair stuck up in improbable angles, and a half-empty mug of coffee teetered dangerously on the edge of the table. He opened the door with a grin that would have been charming if not accompanied by a slight wobble in his stance, a sure sign of impending panic. Evra. What an unexpected surprise, he said, waving his hands as though grand gestures could mask his culpability. Lion, Evra said, her voice calm but loaded with the intensity of 1,000 unspoken words. We need to talk. And this time, I want absolute honesty. No creative liquidity, no shrimp analogies, no spreadsheet hieroglyphics. Lion blinked. Absolute honesty? You mean, tell the truth. He swallowed, the grin fading slightly. Because, if you mean that, then I guess I have to recalibrate my storytelling skills. Evra stepped inside, brushing past him and setting her bag down. Recalibrate your storytelling skills? Lion, this isn't a rehearsal for a play. This is us. This is real. And I won't be in a relationship where I don't know the truth. Lion rubbed the back of his neck, the beginnings of sweat gathering at his hairline. Truth? Well, it's complicated. You see, sometimes truths are flexible. And sometimes, well, the truth is adventurous. He paused, realizing that his verbal acrobatics were unlikely to satisfy her, or anyone with a functioning moral compass. Evra exhaled slowly, her frustration mixing with the faintest hint of amusement. She had loved Lion for his charm, his intelligence, and, admittedly, his absurd capacity for self-delusion. But charm and self-delusion were not substitutes for honesty. Lion, she said firmly, start from the beginning. Every lie, every omission, every tiny deception. Leave nothing out. And so he began. Or rather, he attempted to. The story that emerged was a convoluted tapestry of half-truths, exaggerated bravado, and comically tragic errors. He spoke of Donatello, the Dubai project, the absurdly elaborate shrimp-based financial misadventures, and the moments where he had tried, and spectacularly failed, to conceal his mistakes. He confessed to exaggerating numbers, fudging reports, and occasionally talking to his spreadsheets as if they were sentient beings capable of moral judgment. Evra listened, at first with a stern expression, then with growing disbelief, and finally with peals of laughter that caught both her and Lion off guard. It was impossible not to laugh at the spectacle of his earnest yet bumbling attempts at honesty. You actually thought talking to a spreadsheet would help?" she asked, tears of laughter streaming down her face. "Well," Lion said, defensive yet sheepish, "it seemed rational at the time. The spreadsheet was very convincing. It agreed with me." Julie, who had followed Evra out of professional curiosity and personal amusement, clapped her hands. Progress. Emotional growth through inanimate objects. Gob, lurking in the background as usual, muttered, "I warned him about shrimp. No one listens. No one ever listens." Evra, sensing that the comedic undertone was softening the sting of his deceit, decided to turn the confrontation into a game of trust. She proposed a series of exercises, humorous, absurd, but aimed at re-establishing honesty and connection. First, a literal shrimp apology parade, in which Lion had to carry a tray of cooked shrimp through the living room while reciting rhymed confessions. Then, a spreadsheet transparency hour, displaying every document, real or imaginary, for Evra's scrutiny. Finally, a solo interpretive dance of regret, performed with exaggerated flair to demonstrate the sincerity of his contrition. Lion complied with a mixture of dignity, embarrassment, and dramatic exaggeration. As he pranced through the apartment, reciting his shrimp-infused rhymes and twirling amid stacks of paper, Evra found herself laughing until her cheeks ached. The absurdity of it all, the seriousness of his contrition juxtaposed with the ridiculousness of the methods, melted the residual bitterness in her heart. As evening descended, and the exercises concluded, the apartment was filled with the kind of quiet exhaustion that follows both physical exertion and cathartic laughter. Evra and Lion sat side by side, catching their breath. Lion, still slightly out of shape from his impromptu dance, looked at Evra with a mixture of hope and humility. "So," Evra said softly, "honesty, it's not easy, is it?" "Not in the slightest," Lion admitted. "But I think I'm getting the hang of it." She smiled. "And I think I'm willing to try again." Slowly, comically, ridiculously, but together. Thus, the absurd and imperfect journey toward rebuilding trust began. They spent the next hours planning small, deliberate acts of transparency and humor, joint painting sessions where mistakes were celebrated, cooking experiments where every burnt dish became a lesson in humility, and walks around the city where the only rule was to speak honestly, no matter how silly the truth sounded. Outside, the neighbors observed the unfolding drama with keen interest. Mrs. Kowalski whispered, "They're back together. After all that drama." Mr. Henderson replied, "It's like watching a reality show, but better scripted." The teenager from 3B muttered under his breath, "I told you shrimp would fix everything," earning a nod of solemn agreement from the others. The building itself seemed to vibrate with collective amusement and approval. Days turned into weeks, and each comedic test of honesty brought Evra and Lion closer. Lion's initial awkwardness evolved into self-aware charm, Evra's sternness softened into playful teasing. They discovered that laughter, absurd rituals, and shared ridiculousness could heal wounds that words alone might never touch. Gob occasionally inserted himself into proceedings, documenting failures and successes with a level of dedication that bordered on obsessive, offering commentary that ranged from prophetic to hilariously hyperbolic. By the time the city lights blinked awake in the evening, Lion and Evra had developed a routine, moments of sincere conversation punctuated by absurd exercises, spontaneous acts of comedic contrition, and mutual acknowledgement of their human flaws. The shrimp metaphor, once a symbol of deception and folly, became a running joke, a reminder that even the most preposterous errors could be transformed into instruments of honesty and intimacy. As they sat together, arms brushing, their laughter finally subsiding, Evra reflected on the journey they had undertaken. The pain of betrayal had been real, but the path through comedy, honesty, and mutual absurdity had restored a bond that was now stronger, more resilient, and infinitely more entertaining. Lion, for his part, understood that sincerity required vulnerability, humility, and, occasionally, interpretive dance. And so, with the city as their backdrop, the couple embraced a future where honesty was practiced not as a solemn duty but as a shared, joyous adventure. They would continue to stumble, to bumble, and to laugh, knowing that love, like comedy, is at its most enduring when it is honest, imperfect, and thoroughly ridiculous. And in this newfound harmony, the story of Evra and Lion continued, absurd, heartfelt, and endlessly entertaining, leaving neighbors, friends, and perhaps even Donatello to marvel at the improbable resilience of trust, humor, and love. Chapter 17 The Breaking Point. Evra stormed into the apartment with a folder clutched tightly under her arm, her heels clicking like a metronome of impending doom. She stopped in the doorway, glaring at Lion, who had just managed to spill coffee on his own keyboard in a moment of pure nervous anticipation. The air was thick with tension, though the sight of the coffee-soaked laptop added a ridiculous touch that made Evra pause, ever so slightly, before her temper fully erupted. "Lion," she said, her voice sharp but controlled, "I have all the proof I need. Every lie, every little scheme, every time you avoided me, I know it all." Lion froze mid-wipe, a coffee-stained paper towel in one hand, the other hovering awkwardly over the keyboard. "Evra, wait, I can explain." "Explain," she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Do you know what it's like to live with someone who treats honesty like an exotic dish reserved for special occasions?" Lion shuffled nervously, muttering to himself, "Special occasions, honesty. I could have made a calendar, maybe an honesty advent calendar." Evra groaned. "Stop. Just stop. I want the truth, Lion. No more games, no more excuses, no more coffee disasters. Just honesty." And that's when it happened. The dam broke. Lion, eyes wide and red-rimmed, dropped the rag and the pretense. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, shaking, mumbling something incomprehensible about pressure, expectations, and a fear of disappointing not just Evra but himself. "Lion." Evra softened slightly, sensing the vulnerability beneath the chaos. "Talk to me." He lifted his head, his hair sticking out in a manner reminiscent of a startled porcupine. "Evra, I was scared. Scared you'd leave me if I told you the truth about everything. The Dubai project, Donatello, the spreadsheets, the graphs, the Excel macros, they became like monsters, Evra, monsters that whispered I was a failure." Evra blinked. "You created monsters in Excel. Not just any monsters. Pivot table dragons. VLOOKUP goblins. Formulas that cursed me." Lion cried, throwing his arms wide as if conducting a symphony of corporate horror. Evra couldn't help but laugh, a short, incredulous laugh that grew into a full-blown giggle. "You're ridiculous," she said, shaking her head, though her heart ached to see him like this. "But I get it. I really do." Lion sniffled and wiped his nose with the sleeve of his shirt. "I thought I was protecting us, protecting you from stress, protecting me from me. But all I did was lie. Every time I smiled, every time I nodded, every time I said I'm fine, I was lying." Evra sat beside him, gently taking his hand. "You could have just talked to me, you know. All this could have been avoided with a single conversation." Lion gave a weak laugh. "I know. I know now. I was a coward wrapped in a spreadsheet. I should have told you everything from the start." And so, they talked. 4 hours. Lion confessed to every ridiculous, embarrassing detail of his deceit, from tiny white lies about meetings that never happened to overblown tales of corporate espionage involving Donatello's bafflingly absurd instructions. Evra listened, sometimes laughing, sometimes gasping, sometimes shaking her head in disbelief at the comedy of errors that had been her boyfriend's life. At one point, Lion stood on the couch, waving a pen dramatically. "And then there was the time I accidentally forwarded the wrong email to the entire company. I swear, I didn't mean to include the cat video in the quarterly report." Evra laughed until tears streamed down her face. "You are unbelievable," she cried. "But, you're my unbelievable, I suppose." By late evening, the apartment looked like a tornado had hit a stationery store. Papers, pens, empty coffee cups, and a lonely cat figurine lay scattered across the floor. Yet, despite the mess, a strange sense of peace settled over them. They had reached the breaking point, endured the chaos, and emerged battered but still together. Lion leaned back, exhausted but smiling sheepishly. "So, we're okay." Evra nudged him gently. "We're more than okay. We're ridiculous, and perfectly ridiculous together. But yes, we're okay." Outside, the neighbors' lights flickered in silent observation, as if the universe itself had tuned in to witness the absurd, heartfelt reconciliation. Somewhere down the hall, a faint voice shouted, "Keep it down. Some of us are trying to watch soap operas," which only added to the comedy of the night. Lion, taking Evra's hand, whispered, "I promise, no more secrets. Just me, the spreadsheets, and the occasional cat video in official emails." Evra laughed, shaking her head. "Deal. But if you ever try to hide a pivot table dragon from me again, I swear you'll laugh," Lion suggested hopefully. "Yes," Evra said firmly, but only after a dramatic, exaggerated lecture with sound effects. And so they sat, hand in hand, laughing at the absurdity of life, the ridiculousness of secrets, and the beauty of finding honesty and humor in each other. The breaking point had been reached, and from it, they had crafted a stronger, sillier, more honest connection. A bond fortified not by perfection, but by absurdity, love, and the occasional Excel-induced panic. As the night deepened, the city hummed outside their window. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm blared. Somewhere closer, a neighbor tripped over a stray garden gnome. And somewhere in the apartment, two people laughed until their cheeks ached, hearts lighter than they had been in months. It was the beginning of a new chapter, unpredictable, comedic, and beautifully theirs. Chapter 18 The Aftermath of Truth. The morning sunlight crept through the blinds like an unwelcome auditor, casting stripes of accusation across the living room. Lion sat cross-legged on the sofa, laptop balanced precariously on his knees, staring at a screen filled with numbers that looked like a foreign language written in hieroglyphs and bad handwriting. His hair, once meticulously combed, now defied gravity in all directions, a silent testimony to nights spent wrangling with chaos he couldn't possibly control. Evra watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. There was something undeniably entertaining about the sight. Lion, usually so polished and self-assured, reduced to a human pretzel of panic and paperwork. "You're still doing it?" she asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and amusement. Lion didn't look up. "Doing what?" he mumbled, which was technically true. He was no longer doing business so much as performing a tragicomic pantomime of business. "Pretending you can fix this." Evra gestured toward the laptop, toward the crumpled documents, the coffee-stained spreadsheets. "Lion, it's over. The Dubai project is officially a disaster of monumental proportions." He winced, but only slightly. "Monumental? Really? I was going for epically catastrophic." "Monumental sounds tame." Evra raised an eyebrow. "Tame? Lion, we're talking about millions evaporating into thin air. And somehow, you still manage to make it sound like a punchline." He finally looked at her, sheepish, guilty, yet somehow still endearingly ridiculous. "It's the only defense mechanism I have left." For a moment, the room was quiet, the air filled with an unspoken acknowledgement. Yes, the business was ruined, yes, he had deceived her, and yet, here they were, both alive, both still able to breathe and, for some inexplicable reason, laugh. Evra walked over and perched on the edge of the sofa, her eyes studying him. "You know," she said, "honesty might have been useful a lot earlier, but I suppose seeing you flail like a fish on dry land is educational." Lion groaned, dramatically throwing his head back. "Oh, I see. Educational. That's the word. You're learning from my misery. Excellent. Glad my suffering serves some purpose." "Yes," she said, deadpan. "You're a cautionary tale. Also a comedic one." He sat up, wincing. "Fine. I accept my role as the tragicomic hero. Can we move on now?" Evra smirked. "Move on? Oh, we'll move on. But first, you're going to answer one simple question: why didn't you tell me the truth sooner?" Lion looked at her as if she'd asked him to solve quantum physics using only a spoon. "Because I was scared? Because I thought I was protecting you?" Because I didn't want to admit that I could be both brilliant and catastrophically wrong at the same time. Both? That's an impressive range, Evra muttered, hiding a laugh. Exactly. Lion exclaimed, throwing his arms wide. Brilliance and disaster, two sides of the same coin. Also, apparently, a very heavy coin that can crush relationships. Evra shook her head, half exasperated, half amused. And yet, somehow, here we are, still standing, though I must say, my trust in you is thin. Thin, yes. Fragile, perhaps. But reparable? Lion asked, a hopeful glimmer in his eyes. Evra considered this, then leaned in conspiratorially. Reparable, maybe. If you're willing to perform what I like to call a full comedy of redemption. Lion tilted his head. A comedy of redemption. Yes, she said with mock severity. First task, make me laugh every day for a week. No excuses, no hiding, no failed spreadsheets. Just, pure, unadulterated attempts at humor. He gasped. Daily laughter, for a week? Do you know what this entails? Yes. I do. And I expect results. Thus began what could only be described as the most absurdly structured week of their lives. Lion threw himself into it with the dedication of a man who had nothing left to lose except dignity. On Monday, he attempted stand-up in the kitchen, narrating the tragic saga of a lost contract while juggling oranges, which ended predictably with one hitting him squarely in the forehead. Evra, true to her word, laughed not unkindly, but with the sharp edge of incredulity that only real amusement could bring. Tuesday involved a puppet show using socks and an old broomstick, retelling the story of his failed business venture with dramatic flair and ridiculous voices. Evra applauded politely, laughing through tears of both exasperation and genuine delight. By Wednesday, Lion had recruited the neighbor's cat into his performances, claiming it represented the unpredictable market forces. The cat, naturally, had its own agenda, clawing the curtains and wandering across the keyboard mid-performance. Evra laughed so hard she fell onto the sofa, tears streaking her face, realizing that maybe, just maybe, Lion's ridiculous attempts were doing exactly what she needed, breaking down the wall of anger and disappointment she had been carrying. Thursday's performance was a silent mime act involving the printer, a spilled coffee cup, and a very startled pigeon that had wandered in from the balcony. Evra, now fully invested, couldn't stop laughing, her laughter echoing through the apartment and bouncing off walls that had seemed so oppressive just weeks ago. By Friday, Lion had exhausted himself, collapsing dramatically on the floor. Evra approached him, sat beside him, and offered a hand, which he accepted with theatrical solemnity. You know, she said, this helps. Seeing you, failing so spectacularly, and yet trying so hard, it's strangely comforting. He looked up, his eyes bright despite the exhaustion. Comforting? He asked, incredulous. Yes. And it's making me think, maybe you can be trusted again. Slowly. Tentatively. Like holding a fragile, slightly explosive kitten. Lion laughed, a real laugh, not a performance. Fragile, slightly explosive, sounds like a business partner, a relationship, and apparently me all at once. Saturday brought a quiet, shared breakfast. No juggling, no sock puppets, no mime acts. Just coffee, toast, and the kind of gentle, tentative conversation that suggested both humor and hope. They discussed small plans, fixing the balcony railing, reorganizing the living room, perhaps starting a small, honest business together, not Dubai scale, not catastrophic, just manageable. Sunday, they took a walk through the neighborhood, laughing at the absurdity of their week-long comedy redemption arc. The neighbors peeked curiously from windows, some shaking their heads, some chuckling at the sight of Lion performing exaggerated pratfalls while Evra clutched her sides with laughter. Even the local barista had begun referring to Lion as the comedy guy with tragic flair, which made him beam. By the end of the week, the apartment felt lighter. The air no longer pressed down with unspoken resentment. Laughter, shared effort, and absurdity had begun to rebuild what deception had almost destroyed. Small gestures, offering tea without spilling it, leaving notes with terrible puns, walking the cat in a tiny homemade cape became symbols of trust, care, and renewed connection. Evra realized that while Lion had made mistakes, his willingness to be vulnerable, ridiculous, and utterly human was far more valuable than any flawless business plan or carefully crafted deception. And Lion, seeing Evra's cautious acceptance, felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in months, the slow, steady rebuilding of love on a foundation of humor, honesty, and shared absurdity. The week closed with a quiet evening on the balcony. Lion held a slightly charred marshmallow over a tiny, improvised flame, while Evra recounted the highlights of his comedic failures. They laughed until the stars blinked awake, the city lights twinkling below, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were not victims of secrets, lies, or ambition. They were simply themselves, together, and perfectly imperfect. And in that imperfection, there was hope. Chapter 19 Rebuilding Bridges. The morning began like any other in the Lion-Evra household, with a series of minor catastrophes masquerading as routine. Lion was sprawled across the kitchen floor, notebook in hand, a pencil lodged suspiciously behind his ear, trying to assemble what he optimistically called the master plan for financial and emotional rehabilitation. Evra, perched on a chair with arms crossed and coffee in hand, regarded him as one might regard a mildly dangerous but charmingly hapless animal. "You're still doing that?" she asked, indicating the chaotic spread of papers, sticky notes, and pens strewn across the floor like confetti at a very low-budget parade. Lion didn't look up. "Doing what?" he asked, which was technically accurate. "Planning our salvation. Step 1, identify the problems. Step 2, solve them with charisma, wit, and minimal collateral damage." Evra raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Minimal collateral damage? You mean, like last time when your minimal resulted in 3 broken chairs, a flooded bathroom, and an emotional breakdown that lasted exactly 72 hours. 72 hours? That's generous," Lion said, wincing. "It was actually closer to 72 minutes of full-blown panic and 3 hours of silent sulking. Details matter." Evra sighed. "Right. Details matter. Which is why today, we focus on honesty and transparency. No improvisational theatrics. No juggling flaming marshmallows. Just talk." Lion groaned. "Talk? Can we at least schedule it as a dramatic dialogue with appropriate background music? Maybe some fog for ambience." "No fog," Evra said firmly, "and the only music allowed is the sound of your own voice saying the truth." Thus began the first official meeting in the Great Rebuilding Bridge project of Lion and Evra, an enterprise more complicated than any business plan Lion had ever conceived and more delicate than any vase Evra had ever almost broken in frustration. "Okay," Evra started, "first, let's set ground rules. Number 1, honesty. Number 2, listening. Number 3, no evasive pirouettes when answering questions." Lion saluted, though it was more theatrical than functional, knocking over a cup of pens in the process. "Acknowledged. Ground rules accepted. No pirouettes, no evasions. I will attempt honesty under duress." Evra hid a smile. "Good. Now, what do you need from me to feel supported while you fix your life?" Lion scratched his head, clearly overthinking. "Support? Well, emotional encouragement is nice. Humor is essential. And, maybe occasional moral reinforcement when I consider running away to join the circus." Evra chuckled. "I think we can manage that. Your turn, what do you need from me to feel safe being honest?" Lion considered carefully. "Safety, freedom from judgment when I admit mistakes, acknowledgement when I actually succeed at something, and, maybe chocolate. Chocolate is helpful." Evra nodded thoughtfully. Chocolate is negotiable. The rest, we can try. But this requires boundaries. Clear, enforceable boundaries. Like, don't lie, don't hide information, and don't invent imaginary employees who escaped to Bermuda. Noted, Lion said solemnly, though one could detect a trace of sadness that his Bermuda-based employees would never be needed. And so began a week of structured honesty exercises, which quickly escalated into absurdly comical scenarios. Monday involved each revealing a minor secret from the past week. Lion confessed to attempting to fix the kitchen faucet with duct tape, resulting in an indoor fountain that had somehow also affected the electrical outlets. Evra confessed to secretly binge-eating cookies she had hidden behind the toaster, an act of culinary rebellion she deemed necessary for sanity. Tuesday's exercise required them to share their daily intentions while maintaining eye contact, a simple task that turned into a battlefield of suppressed giggles. Lion's attempts to describe financial planning without turning it into a three-act comedy were interrupted repeatedly by Evra's smirks, and Evra's earnest plans to reorganize the bookshelf into color-coded perfection were mocked by Lion's exaggerated horror at alphabetical tyranny. By Wednesday, their exercises escalated. They were required to express frustrations using only interpretive dance. Lion attempted to mime regret over lost investments while balancing a stack of pillows as a metaphor for emotional baggage. Evra, not to be outdone, enacted the crushing weight of secrecy and deception through a series of spins, leaps, and an unfortunate collision with the cat, which became an unwilling participant in the choreography. Thursday introduced the trust jar experiment. Each wrote down fears, anxieties, and petty grievances on slips of paper and deposited them into a jar. They then took turns drawing them, reading aloud, and discussing calmly, though calmly in Lion's case involved dramatic sighs, faint swooning, and occasional fainting onto the sofa. Evra responded with patient guidance and occasional sarcastic commentary, such as, "Ah yes, the fear of being wrong." Classic Lion. Timeless. Also, hilarious. By Friday, they had begun what Evra called synchronization exercises, coordinated morning routines to foster teamwork and shared responsibility. They made breakfast together, which involved a dangerous experiment with a blender and unripe bananas, walked the cat on a leash, and scheduled their workdays so neither felt excluded or burdened. The week's finale included a fully choreographed attempt at reorganizing Lion's workspace into something resembling efficiency, which ended with Evra fainting from laughter at Lion's insistence that every pen must align with cosmic energy flow. Over the weekend, they practiced communication through storytelling. Each recounted a past failure, an embarrassing moment, and what they had learned from it. Lion dramatically narrated a tale of a failed date involving a souffle, a runaway pigeon, and a misunderstood love note, while Evra recounted a story of misadventures in online shopping that resulted in 3 identical lamps and one very confused delivery driver. By the end, laughter had transformed into reflection, and reflection into shared understanding. The most important breakthrough came not through elaborate exercises, but in small gestures. Lion left sticky notes with sincere messages of gratitude on the fridge. Evra brewed tea just the way he liked it. They began to preemptively check in with each other, asking permission before making decisions that affected the other, and apologizing for mistakes before they escalated. The humor remained, but it softened into a gentle rhythm of care, patience, and respect. By the end of the second week, Lion and Evra sat together on the balcony, a notebook of new plans between them. The city hummed below, indifferent to their personal triumphs, yet in that small apartment, the world seemed orderly, bright, and full of possibility. Evra reached for his hand, tentatively. "You know. I think we're making progress." Lion squeezed it back. "Progress, cautiously optimistic progress." "Yes," she agreed. "Boundaries, honesty, transparency, and chocolate." "Of course," Lion said solemnly, nodding. "Chocolate is non-negotiable." And so, step by step, misstep by misstep, absurdity by absurdity, Lion and Evra rebuilt their bridge, not perfect, not flawless, but theirs. A bridge strong enough to weather mistakes, laugh at absurdity, and maybe even survive the occasional flooded bathroom. In the evenings, they would recount the day's events, laughing at mistakes and celebrating small victories. Conversations became less about blame and more about solutions. Even the cat seemed to approve, curling between them as if to say, "Finally, some stability around here," though I remain mildly skeptical. Through it all, one truth became clear: rebuilding bridges is never a straight path. It is messy, sometimes ridiculous, occasionally painful, but ultimately rewarding. The bridge between Lion and Evra was no longer a fragile structure of half-truths and fear. It was a living, breathing testament to their willingness to try, fail, and try again. By the time the sun set on the third week, the apartment radiated warmth, humor, and cautious hope. And for Lion and Evra, that was enough to believe in a future where honesty, laughter, and tiny acts of care could coexist in harmony, making every day an adventure in rebuilding what they had almost lost. Chapter 20 The Eternity of Connection. The morning light slanted through the blinds like a golden spotlight on a theater stage, illuminating Lion and Evra in a tableau that could only be described as domestic chaos meets romantic comedy. Lion was perched precariously on the edge of the couch, wearing mismatched socks, one with tiny penguins, the other a kaleidoscope swirl, typing furiously on a laptop that had clearly seen better days. Evra stood nearby, holding a tray with 2 cups of coffee and a slice of something vaguely resembling banana bread, but with what appeared to be experimental sprinkles. "Are those sprinkles?" Lion asked, peering suspiciously over the top of his glasses. "They're a metaphor," Evra said solemnly. "For the unpredictable nature of life." Lion tilted his head. "Right. I thought you were just trying to poison me creatively." Evra smirked. "Creative poison is the highest form of love." And so it began, the latest chapter in their endless comedy of honesty and shared quirks. After weeks of trust exercises, absurd interpretive dance, chocolate-fueled negotiations, and synchronized misadventures, they had arrived at a place neither entirely expected, a kind of chaotic harmony. "Lion," Evra said, setting the tray down carefully on the coffee table, "we have officially survived 3 weeks of intentional honesty, unplanned disasters, and one very judgmental cat. I think that deserves recognition." Lion paused, dramatically placing one hand on his chest. "Recognition? I demand a medal. Or at least a ceremonial ribbon. Perhaps embroidered with our motto, 'We survived each other and lived to laugh about it.'" Evra laughed, and for a moment, the apartment seemed to shake with the force of their mirth. "Close enough. We can settle for that. Now, the real question, do we still remember how to flirt?" Lion raised an eyebrow. "Flirt? I thought we graduated to advanced honesty exercises. Flirting seems dangerously frivolous." "Exactly," Evra said, leaning against the counter. "Frivolity is good for the soul. Also, it's hilarious to watch you try." Over the next hour, they engaged in what might generously be called a flirt-off, each attempting to outdo the other with playful innuendos, exaggerated sighs, and absurdly poetic declarations about household appliances. Lion serenaded the toaster. Evra wrote limericks about the vacuum cleaner. By the time the cat got involved, leaping onto the keyboard and sending a string of gibberish emails to Lion's boss, they were both laughing so hard they cried. "You know," Lion said between fits of laughter, "this is probably the healthiest our relationship has ever been. Full honesty, full chaos, full cat interference. What more could one ask for?" Evra perched on the edge of the couch, brushing crumbs off her lap. "A little predictability, maybe. And fewer toaster serenades." "Predictability is overrated," Lion said solemnly. "Besides, you love my singing." "I tolerate it," Evra replied, mock seriously. "Which counts as love in my book." They spent the afternoon playing a strange hybrid of charades and storytelling, recounting past mistakes and dramatizing them with puppet-like enthusiasm. Lion reenacted the infamous banana blender incident, while Evra narrated the cookie rebellion, complete with shadow puppets on the wall. Their laughter filled every corner of the apartment, bouncing off the walls and into the city beyond. By evening, they had settled into their usual ritual, sitting side by side on the balcony, sipping tea and watching the sun set. There was a serenity to the moment, but also the ever-present absurdity of life. The cat draped across Lion's lap, a lone sock hanging from the railing like a flag of minor defeat, and a half-eaten slice of banana sprinkle bread precariously balanced on the railing's edge. Evra reached for Lion's hand. "You know," she said softly, "I don't think we'll ever stop having little disasters. But I'm glad we've learned how to survive them together." Lion squeezed her hand, a grin spreading across his face. "Agreed. Disasters may come. Chaos may reign. But at least we have each other. And chocolate." "Chocolate," Evra said, nodding solemnly. "Always chocolate." As darkness settled over the city, the apartment glowed with small lights, laughter, and the quiet murmur of two people who had endured deception, confusion, and personal eccentricities, and emerged not only intact but connected on a level that bordered on the eternal. The next morning, they attempted to cook breakfast together. This time, it involved pancakes, a cat wearing a tiny chef's hat, and an accidental flour explosion that coated the entire kitchen in a fine white dust. Lion looked at Evra, flour speckled on her nose. "I think this might be the happiest disaster of my life." Evra laughed, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "It's perfect," she said. "Flour, laughter, chaos, honesty, all the ingredients of our eternal connection." As they sat down to eat somewhat resembling humans again despite the kitchen carnage, they talked about the future. Plans, hopes, and even fears were shared openly, without pretense or evasion. Every glance, every joke, every silly comment carried the weight of their journey, the lessons learned, and the trust painstakingly rebuilt. In the following days, Lion introduced daily comedy checks, a practice in which each would perform a small absurd act to keep laughter alive in the household. Evra orchestrated Honesty Hour, a ritual where confessions, minor, humorous, or occasionally embarrassing, were shared without fear. Even the cat, now a fully integrated participant in their routines, had a small bell attached to its collar to mark comedic entrances and exits. Weeks turned into months, and the apartment, once a place of tentative apologies and cautious gestures, became a sanctuary of chaotic love. Lion and Evra discovered that the key to eternal connection was not perfection, but a willingness to laugh, forgive, and embrace the unpredictability of life together. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows, they recreated their very first failed cooking attempt, blender, bananas, and all with slightly better results. They laughed through minor explosions of whipped cream, accidental spills, and dramatic swooning over pancake collapse. It was absurd, ridiculous, and deeply intimate. "This," Lion said, holding a slightly misshapen pancake aloft, "is what forever looks like." Evra smiled, reaching out to steady it. "Forever," she agreed. "Messy, ridiculous, honest, hilarious, ours." And in that moment, amidst the flour clouds, errant sprinkles, and the approving purr of the cat, Lion and Evra understood that their connection was not just a series of exercises or reconciliations, it was an ongoing comedy, a shared adventure, and a celebration of imperfection. They kissed, flour and all, sealing the day with a simple truth: love, when built on honesty, laughter, and the courage to embrace absurdity, could indeed feel eternal. Evenings passed, days blended into weeks, and life continued with its usual mix of minor catastrophes and joyous victories. Lion and Evra navigated each challenge with humor, compassion, and trust. Their bond became a living, breathing entity, simultaneously absurd, beautiful, and eternal. And so, the apartment, now permanently decorated with sticky notes of encouragement, chocolate stashes in strategic locations, and a small collection of hats for the cat, stood as a testament to their journey, a comedic, heartfelt, and enduring celebration of love, honesty, and the chaos that makes life truly worth living. Every laugh, every shared glance, Every ridiculous pancake mishap reinforced one immutable truth: Lion and Evra had discovered the eternity of connection not in perfection, but in joy, absurdity, and unwavering honesty. In the end, they lay side by side on the balcony, gazing at the stars, sharing whispered jokes only they could understand. The world outside continued its relentless pace, but inside, time seemed to pause. And in that pause, flower-dusted, laughter-filled, and full of chocolate, Lion and Evra knew one thing for certain: they were home in each other, in the chaos, and in the endless comedy of connection. As the night deepened, the cat snuggled between them, purring like a tiny, judgmental symphony conductor. Lion whispered, "Ready for tomorrow?" Evra smirked, brushing flour from her hair. "Always. And let's keep the chocolate handy." With that, they drifted to sleep, hearts full, laughter lingering in the air, ready to face whatever absurdities and joys the world might throw at them next.